Hey everyone, today we're stepping into a 1960s American kitchen where the freezer door opened with a little tug frost clung to the metal compartment and a rectangular foil tray waited behind the ice cream and the frozen orange juice. Inside that tray were separate little territories, sliced meat under brown gravy potatoes pressed into a pale mound peas, lined up in their own corner, and a dessert that was expected to survive the same oven as everything else. It looked modern, efficient, and almost futuristic. It also required enough patience to heat that the phrase instant dinner would have been doing some very generous work. Today we're revisiting 30 foods that many American families knew well, not because every home served the same menu, but because these dishes, packages, and pantry habits captured the way ordinary people balanced money-time appetite and family expectations during the decade. If you enjoy opening old cupboards, freezer drawers, recipe boxes, and grocery bags with us, please like the video and subscribe to Forgotten American Home, where we bring back the foods, shopping habits, kitchen rules, and family traditions that shaped everyday life. Which 1960s food on this list do you remember most clearly? And what meal did your family serve so often that you could recognize it from the smell before you reached the kitchen to belong on this list? A food had to be more than merely old. It had to connect to a real household routine, a familiar package, a family budget, a lunchbox, a church basement, a school tray, or a dinner table where someone was always asking whether you'd eaten enough vegetables. The first item is the aluminum tray television dinner, one of the clearest symbols of the 1960s promise that modern packaging could reorganize family life. You found it in the supermarket freezer case stacked in bright cardboard boxes with photographs that looked far tidier than the meal would after 20 or 30 minutes in a home oven. The box promised a complete dinner. The tray delivered meat, potatoes, vegetables, and sometimes dessert in separate compartments, as though supper had been designed by a committee worried about peas crossing the border. At home, someone peeled away the outer package, read the heating instructions, adjusted the oven rack, and placed the light foil tray on a baking sheet, so it would not buckle under its own ambitions. Then came the wait. The kitchen warmed, the refrigerator motor clicked on, and the television in the next room carried voices through the doorway, while the frozen center slowly became edible. The television dinner mattered because it seemed to turn several household problems into one purchase. There was no need to plan a main dish, side dish, and dessert separately. Portions were already decided. The freezer kept the meal available for a night when work ran late. A parent was tired, children had different schedules, or the family wanted something that felt more exciting than leftovers. In many homes, however, convenience did not mean the absence of labor. Someone still had to shop for the boxes, fit them into a small freezer, remember which family member disliked peas, heat the oven, keep track of the time, carry the flimsy trays without bending them, and wash the glasses and silverware afterward. The meal simplified dinner, but it did not cause the kitchen to operate by itself. Old advertising often treated convenience as if one cardboard package could restore peace to the entire household. The package was optimistic. The family remained a family. For children, the tray itself could be as memorable as the food. Each compartment created a little sequence. You might begin with the potatoes, scrape gravy across the divider, save the dessert for last, or eat the corn first because a parent was watching. The aluminum made a faint scraping sound under the fork, and the edges stayed unexpectedly hot even after the center had cooled. Some families carried the trays into the living room on folding tables. Others kept everyone at the kitchen table, because buying a television dinner did not automatically cancel the household rule that meals belonged in one room and television belonged in another. In homes where eating in front of the screen was allowed, the meal became part of the evening program. The tray rested on a lap table, a commercial break arrived, and everyone discovered that cutting a piece of meat with a lightweight fork on a folding surface required more coordination than the box had mentioned. Not every household welcomed the television dinner in the same way. For some, it was a treat because each person received an individual meal and the package looked new. For others, it was emergency food kept for nights when there was no time to cook. Families with larger appetites sometimes found the portions small, while budget-conscious shoppers compared the price of several boxed meals with what the same money might buy in ground beef potatoes, canned vegetables, or noodles. Rural families, households without much freezer space, and communities served by smaller stores may have encountered the products differently from suburban shoppers standing before long illuminated freezer cases. Taste also varied. One person remembered the gravy fondly. Another remembered potatoes with the texture of warm plaster. Both memories could be true sometimes from the same tray. What made the television dinner last in memory was not that it replaced family cooking. It showed that family cooking was beginning to share the kitchen with a new kind of food system built around freezing packaging supermarket display and the promise of saved time. The tray brought the factory, the freezer aisle, the oven, and the television set into one small domestic ritual. It made dinner feel individual even when everyone was eating together, and modern even when someone still had to remind a child not to scrape the fork through the foil. By the end of the decade, the freezer had become a more important part of meal planning in many households, but the glass casserole dish had not disappeared. In fact, just beyond the television tray waited two foods that asked for more mixing, more stretching, and more faith in leftovers: tuna noodle casserole and meatloaf with a glossy ketchup top. A glass casserole dish waited on the Formica counter, its sides fogged slightly from warm noodles and a pale sauce that seemed capable of holding nearly anything together. Tuna noodle casserole was not elegant, but elegance was rarely the first concern on a weekday evening when several people needed to be fed from one dish. Egg noodles, canned tuna condensed soup peas, and whatever crunchy topping the household preferred could be assembled with ingredients already waiting in the pantry. Some cooks scattered breadcrumbs across the surface. Others crushed potato chips or crackers over the top, producing a golden layer that snapped beneath the serving spoon. The casserole went into the oven as a collection of inexpensive parts, and came out as a complete meal, bubbling at the edges and smelling of warm starch fish, and the unmistakable promise that nobody would be leaving the table hungry. Its greatest talent was stretching a small amount of protein across several plates. One can of tuna could disappear into enough noodles and sauce to feed a family, particularly when the grocery budget was being watched closely or payday still seemed a few dinners away. The peas added colour even when children treated them as suspicious green interruptions. A little onion, celery, cheese or seasoning might appear depending on what the kitchen contained and what the family tolerated. That flexibility was part of the appeal. Tuna noodle casserole did not demand a special shopping trip or a strict recipe. It accepted substitutions with the patience of a dish that understood household economics. A mother might follow a recipe clipped from a newspaper. Another cook might rely on instructions from a soup label, and a grandmother might insist that no printed version was as good as the one she carried in her head. The labour was simple compared with many older meals, although it was not invisible. Water had to boil. Noodles had to be drained. Cans had to be opened with a manual or electric opener, depending on how modern the kitchen had become. The mixture had to be stirred without crushing the noodles transferred into a baking dish, topped, baked, served, and eventually scraped from the corners where the sauce had dried into a stubborn border. Convenience foods reduced certain steps, but they also created a new style of cooking built around combining packages rather than eliminating preparation altogether. The cook was still expected to transform shelf-stable products into something that felt like dinner rather than an inventory report. tuna noodle casserole succeeded because it could be warm, filling, familiar, and forgiving all at once. It also produced leftovers that could return the following day, although the topping rarely survived with its original dignity. On another evening, the casserole dish might give way to a loaf pan and a mound of ground meat waiting beneath a sheet of wax paper. Meatloaf was less dependent on cans, but it shared the same practical purpose. Ground beef could be mixed with breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, oats, milk, egg, onion, or whatever combination a household had learned to trust. The ingredients added moisture, structure, and volume, allowing the meat to serve more people than a row of individual steaks ever could. The mixture was pressed into a pan or shaped by hand, then covered with a bright stripe of ketchup or a sweeter glaze made from ketchup, brown sugar, mustard, or another family variation. Before baking, it looked plain and slightly unfinished. After an hour in the oven, the top had darkened, the edges had browned, and the kitchen smelled as though dinner had been planned with far more ceremony than the grocery bill might suggest. Every household seemed to have its own opinion about the correct texture. Some meatloaves sliced neatly and held together like a respectable brick. Others crumbled the moment the knife entered, requiring mashed potatoes to help gather the evidence. A child might avoid the visible pieces of onion while an adult carefully chose an end slice because the glaze was thickest there. Mashed potatoes, canned green beans, carrots, or gravy often completed the plate, turning economical ground beef into the kind of dinner that could be placed at the center of the table and served in measured slices. The loaf also carried an unspoken rule of fairness. The cook had to judge how thick each portion could be, without leaving the final person with a piece that looked noticeably smaller. Family arithmetic occurred quietly under the ceiling light, one slice at a time. Meatloaf also understood the value of tomorrow. Cold slices could be tucked between pieces of bread with ketchup, mustard, or mayonnaise and wrapped for lunch. A leftover portion could be reheated in a skillet covered with gravy or served beside eggs. Nothing about the meal needed to be fashionable for it to remain useful. Its endurance came from adaptability. Families could season it according to regional tastes, religious traditions, immigrant backgrounds, and whatever ingredients were affordable or available. Some households remembered a carefully glazed loaf served every week. Others remembered a drier version that required heroic quantities of ketchup. Nostalgia does not always mean the food was perfect. Sometimes it means the meal appeared so regularly that its smell became part of the house itself. Tuna noodle casserole and meatloaf belong to the same domestic language. Both turned modest ingredients into a dish large enough to occupy the center of the table. Both could be adjusted without announcing that the grocery plan had changed. Both required someone to understand portions, leftovers, oven timing, and the preferences of several people who rarely agreed on everything. The casserole hid its economy beneath sauce and a crunchy top. The meatloaf displayed its economy honestly, one careful slice after another. As the baking dishes cooled and the refrigerator made room for leftovers, another style of dinner was waiting nearby, one dressed in brown gravy and given a more formal name. Salisbury steak and chicken a la king would take familiar ingredients and teach them to behave as though company had arrived. Brown gravy reached the plate before the meat did, spreading into the shallow space beside a scoop of mashed potatoes and stopping just short of the canned peas. Salisbury steak arrived as an oval patty rather than a true steak, but the name gave ordinary ground beef a touch of ceremony. In a 1960s kitchen, the patties might be mixed with breadcrumbs, onion, egg, milk, or seasoning, then browned in a skillet while the cook prepared gravy from pan drippings, a packet, a jar, or a can of soup. In other homes, Salisbury steak came from the freezer in a divided aluminum tray, already arranged beside potatoes and vegetables. Either way, it offered the appearance of a composed entree without requiring the price of individual cuts of beef. The oval shape helped. A hamburger patty belonged on a bun. The same meat stretched lengthwise, placed beneath gravy, and served with a knife and fork seemed ready for the dining room. The gravy performed much of the meal's practical work. It added moisture to patties that might otherwise become dry, warmed the potatoes, softened onions, and made the plate look generous even when the portion of meat was carefully measured. Some versions included sliced mushrooms. Others relied on browned onions or a dark, smooth sauce with no visible vegetable complications. Children who disliked onions could spend several minutes moving them toward the edge of the plate while claiming to have eaten nearly everything. The meal also appeared in cafeterias, diners, and frozen food packages, so people encountered it under different circumstances. One person remembered a homemade skillet version with soft onions and rich gravy. Another remembered a school tray where the patty had become surprisingly firm. A third remembered the frozen dinner, whose photograph suggested restaurant elegance while the actual gravy followed its own interpretation of the arrangement. For families watching the grocery budget, Salisbury steak made sense because ground beef could be portioned extended and presented as a complete main dish. The cook could prepare several patties of roughly equal size, and any smaller one could be hidden beneath enough gravy to avoid a formal investigation. Mashed potatoes filled the plate, canned vegetables supplied colour, and bread might appear to collect the remaining sauce. The meal was familiar enough for children, but respectable enough for adults who wanted supper to look planned. Its appeal rested partly in that balance. It was economical without advertising itself as hardship convenient, without necessarily arriving in a box, and adaptable without demanding that anyone call the result creative. By the time the skillet was carried to the sink, the gravy had cooled around the edges, the serving spoon had left a clean path through the pan, and any extra patty had already been assigned to tomorrow's lunch. Across the kitchen, another sauce offered an entirely different performance. Chicken a la king began with pieces of cooked chicken folded into a pale cream sauce, often accompanied by mushrooms, pimientos, green peppers, peas, or another combination chosen by the cook and tolerated by the family. The mixture might be spooned over toast points, biscuits, rice noodles, or pastry shells. Its name sounded grand enough for a hotel dining room. Yet by the 1960s it also belonged comfortably in home kitchens, luncheon menus, cafeterias, and recipes designed to make practical use of cooked poultry. A small amount of chicken could travel a considerable distance once surrounded by sauce. Leftovers that looked insufficient on a plate became plentiful when diced, stirred, and poured over something warm. The transformation was visual as well as practical. Yesterday's chicken returned wearing a cream-coloured coat and a name that suggested it had received a promotion. The dish demanded attention to texture. The sauce needed to be thick enough to remain on the toast but loose enough to spread across it. If it became too thin, the bread surrendered immediately. If it became too thick, the meal could stand on the plate with more confidence than anyone had requested. Toast points brought their own timing problem. Prepared too early, they cooled and softened. Prepared too late, the sauce waited in the pan while the edges began to cling. Biscuits were more forgiving, especially when split open to catch the filling, while pastry shells made the dish appear suitable for company club luncheons or a table set with the better plates. Pimientos added small flashes of red peas, added green and mushrooms, provided the ingredient most likely to divide the room. The finished plate looked mild and polished, but the cook had balanced heat thickness leftovers and family preferences with the concentration of someone managing a much less peaceful kingdom. Chicken a la king also reflected a household skill that convenience advertising sometimes overlooked the ability to make repeated meals feel different. A roasted or boiled chicken could appear first as Sunday dinner, later as sandwiches, and finally as a creamed dish served over toast. The change in form prevented the leftovers from looking like an apology. In households where canned chicken, prepared sauce, or packaged components were used, the meal could be assembled more quickly, although opening cans and stirring a saucepan still did not qualify as the disappearance of labour. Someone selected the ingredients, watched the sauce, toasted the bread, set the table, and found a polite way to explain that the red pieces were pimientos and not something dangerous. The dish's formality was gentle rather than extravagant. It made ordinary ingredients look cared for, which was often more important than making them look expensive. Salisbury steak and chicken a la king approached the same household problem from opposite directions. One covered ground beef in brown gravy and placed it beside potatoes. The other folded bits of chicken into white sauce and carried them to the table on toast or biscuits. Both stretched protein, softened leftovers, and turned sauce into a form of reassurance. They belonged to a decade when families increasingly encountered food through supermarkets, freezer cases, cans recipe booklets, cafeterias and advertisements, but still expected dinner to arrive as a recognizable plate rather than a collection of snacks. The gravies were different. The names sounded more impressive than the grocery lists, and the work remained largely in the kitchen. Next, the sauce would become even plainer, poured over toast beneath thin strips of dried beef, in a meal remembered equally for its thrift, its saltiness, and the nickname many families learned long before they understood where it came from. Thin folds of dried beef waited inside a small jar or package near the canned meats, pressed together so closely that separating them required a fork, a knife, or patient fingers. Once loosened and cut into narrow strips, the beef went into a skillet with a white sauce made from butter or other fat, flour, and milk. The sauce thickened as it warmed, turning smooth and pale while the salty pieces of meat softened inside it. Nearby, slices of white bread stood in the toaster or browned beneath the oven broiler. When everything was ready, the toast went onto the plate and the creamed beef was spooned over the top, covering the crisp surface almost immediately. The finished meal was creamed chipped beef on toast, a plain-looking dish that carried the smell of hot milk, gravy-browned bread, and preserved meat through kitchens long before the 1960s, yet remained familiar in many homes during the decade. The toast beneath the sauce was not decorative. It was the part that made the meal substantial. One slice could become two, and two could turn a modest amount of dried beef and milk into a full plate. The bread caught the gravy, softened at the centre, and stayed slightly crisp around the edges if the meal reached the table quickly enough. Timing mattered. Leave the toast waiting under the sauce and it surrendered completely. Serve it too soon, and someone at the table discovered that white gravy held heat with remarkable determination. Some cooks placed the mixture over split biscuits, boiled potatoes, or mashed potatoes, but toast remained the version many people remembered most clearly. It was inexpensive, dependable, and built from ingredients that could be kept on hand without planning an elaborate dinner. It also looked exactly like what it was. There was no parsley arrangement, no impressive shape, and no colourful vegetable pretending to be excited about the occasion. Dried beef brought its own practical advantages and complications. Because it was cured and heavily salted, it could remain useful in the pantry or refrigerator and provide strong flavour in small amounts. Some cooks rinsed the slices before adding them to the sauce, while others depended on the milk, gravy and toast to soften the saltiness. The jar or package did not appear large, but the beef was never expected to occupy the plate alone. It worked as seasoning texture and protein at the same time. A cook could make more sauce when another person appeared for supper toast, another slice of bread, and stretch the meal with less difficulty than dividing a pork chop or cutting a roast into increasingly diplomatic portions. For families managing a narrow grocery budget, that flexibility mattered. The dish asked for little more than a skillet, a spoon, a few pantry ingredients, and the confidence to stop adding flour before the sauce became suitable for repairing a wall. The meal also carried a strong association with American military food. Versions of creamed dried or chipped beef had been served to service members for years, where large kitchens valued ingredients that could be stored, prepared in quantity, and poured over bread. Veterans brought home memories of the dish, although not always affection for it. Many knew it by the initials, so see Barrack's nickname, that was usually left unexplained at a polite breakfast table. In some families, a father or grandfather used the initials with a grin while children repeated them without being told precisely what they meant. Other households simply called the meal creamed beef, chipped beef on toast, or gravy on toast. The military connection did not mean every home recipe came directly from a mess hall manual. Household cooks adjusted it with pepper, onions, mushrooms, eggs, or different kinds of meat, turning an institutional meal into something shaped by family preference. On a weekday morning, cream chipped beef could be a heavy breakfast served with coffee, eggs, or fruit. At supper, it might arrive alone with a vegetable on the side, especially when time or money was limited. The manual can open a butter, dish flour, canister, milk bottle, or carton and stack of bread formed a simple production line across the counter. The sauce required stirring because milk and flour could punish distraction, with lumps or a scorched layer at the bottom of the pan. Meanwhile, the toaster seemed determined to finish every slice at a different shade of brown. Someone called from another room. A child asked what was for dinner and regretted asking when the answer contained the word chipped. Yet once the plate was served, the meal was warm, salty, filling, and familiar. That combination could earn loyalty even when its appearance offered very little assistance. Children often divided into two camps. Some liked the soft toast and mild gravy, particularly when the beef had been chopped into pieces too small to examine. Others objected to the thin brown strips on sight and attempted to remove them individually, leaving behind a plate of white sauce and evidence. Adults remembered it just as differently. For one person, it was comfort food made by a parent on cold mornings. For another, it was the meal served at the end of a grocery week when the refrigerator looked unusually spacious. Someone else associated it with military service, a diner breakfast, or a grandmother who could make the sauce without measuring anything. The same dish could represent thrift routine, institutional food, family care, or a meal nobody requested but everybody recognized. That is often how forgotten foods survive. The taste fades first, but the skillet, the toast, the jar, and the family joke remain surprisingly clear. Cream-chipped beef on toast gradually lost its central place as tastes changed, and families gained more quick meal choices from freezer cases, boxed dinners, restaurants, and takeout counters. Yet it never disappeared completely. It continued in certain homes, diners, regional menus, and the memories of people who knew that a small amount of preserved meat could be stretched beneath a great deal of gravy. The dish belonged to an older form of convenience, one based not on a complete factory-made meal but on ingredients that allowed the household cook to improvise. The toast was simple, the sauce was practical, and the nickname carried an entire history that children were not supposed to repeat. From this pale skillet supper, the story now moves toward a brighter, messier kind of meal, where ground beef, tomato sauce, and soft buns would turn the dinner table into a test of napkin sleeves and childhood coordination. Ground beef hissed in a skillet while a wooden spoon broke it into smaller pieces, and the smell of onion drifted through the kitchen before the tomato sauce ever reached the pan. Sloppy joes were built for an evening when dinner needed to be warm, filling and ready without a long list of dishes. The cook browned the meat, drained away excess fat, and stirred in a sauce that might contain tomato paste, ketchup, mustard, brown sugar, Worcestershire sauce vinegar, or a prepared seasoning mixture. Every household seemed to recognize the meal, but few agreed on exactly how sweet, thick, or spicy it should be. Once the sauce began to bubble, soft hamburger buns were opened across a plate or baking sheet. The filling was spooned generously onto the bottom halves, and the top buns were placed over it with the hopeful assumption that the sandwich would remain assembled until it reached someone's mouth. That assumption rarely survived the first bite. The filling pressed outward sauce ran toward the wrist, and pieces of meat fell onto the plate, the table, or the front of a shirt that had been clean only moments earlier. The name Sloppy Joe was not false advertising. Children often learn to lean over their plates while adults develop the habit of holding the sandwich with both hands and rotating it toward whichever side seemed least dangerous. A stack of paper napkins stood nearby, although one napkin was seldom enough. The meal appeared at family suppers, school cafeterias, church gatherings, summer camps, and neighborhood events, because the mixture could be prepared in quantity and kept warm in a large skillet or serving pan. It required ordinary ingredients, accepted adjustments without complaint, and could feed more people simply by adding another bun and slightly less filling to each portion. For a household watching its grocery money, Sloppy Joe's offered the same practical advantage as many ground beef meals of the decade. The meat could be stretched with finely chopped onion, celery, peppers sauce, or even a small amount of leftover vegetables that disappeared once the mixture became sufficiently red. The buns made each serving feel complete and inexpensive. Side dishes such as potato chips, pickles, canned corn, coleslaw, or carrot sticks could fill the rest of the plate. Some families made the sauce entirely from pantry staples. Others used a canned sauce or seasoning packet that promised consistent results and fewer decisions. The package made the process easier, but someone still had to brown the meat, open the can, stir the skillet, slice the buns, and determine whether the mixture was thick enough to remain inside the sandwich. Convenience had reached the stove. It had not yet learned to clean it. The meal also carried a relaxed feeling that separated it from meatloaf, Salisbury steak, or other ground beef dinners served with a knife and fork. Sloppy Joes belonged to elbows on the table, quick second helpings, and children asking whether they could eat in front of the television. They could be served on paper plates at a birthday party, or placed on ordinary dinnerware beside a glass of milk. The sandwiches did not require equal slices or formal presentation. They only required enough filling to go around. Yet the cook still faced a familiar calculation. Too little sauce made the mixture dry and crumbly. Too much turned the bun into a sponge. A filling that looked perfect in the skillet could become unexpectedly liquid after sitting for several minutes. The successful Sloppy Joe occupied a narrow territory between sandwich and stew, and every family seemed to know when someone had crossed the border. On another night, the skillet or casserole dish might hold an even simpler combination, franks and beans. Canned baked beans were poured into the pan, hot dogs were sliced into coins or left in larger pieces, and the mixture was heated until the sauce thickened around the meat. Some cooks added mustard, ketchup, onion, molasses, or brown sugar. Others believed the beans were already doing enough and left them alone. The hot dogs made the dish more substantial while the beans supplied sweetness, sauce, and enough volume to feed several people from very few packages. A can opener, a knife, and one pan could produce supper with almost no advance planning. The meal was especially useful when the refrigerator offered no obvious main dish, the grocery trip had been delayed, or the household needed something children would recognize immediately. Franks and beans appeared in kitchens at campgrounds beside picnic tables, and during informal weekend meals when nobody expected the better serving dishes. The smell was sweet, smoky, and unmistakable, particularly when the sauce began to darken around the edges of a casserole. Children could spear the hot dog pieces with a fork or chase them through the beans, while adults often added black pepper or mustard after serving. White bread might be placed on the table to collect the sauce, and potato chips added the crunch the dish itself did not possess. It was inexpensive food, but that did not make it emotionally empty. For some families it meant summer evenings and open windows. For others it meant the final days before payday when the pantry had to become more inventive than the budget. The same plate could feel like a casual treat to a child and careful arithmetic to the person who prepared it. Neither Sloppy Joes nor Franks and Beans demanded admiration. Their value came from reliability. They used familiar packages, tolerated substitutions, and allowed a cook to feed several people without spending the entire afternoon beside the stove. They also reflected a growing 1960s kitchen habit of combining fresh meat with canned sauces, packaged bread, and shelf-stable ingredients. Homemade cooking and convenience food were not always opponents. They often met in the same skillet. One provided the labour and judgment while the other promised speed. When supper ended, the Sloppy Joe sauce left a red ring around the pan, and the beans cooled into a sweet sticky layer that required soaking. The meal had been quick. The cleanup remained traditional. From those warm skillets, the story moves toward the lunchbox shelf where a rectangular can of Spam and a stack of bologna waited to become breakfast sandwiches and some of the most recognizable smells of the school day. A rectangular can sat on the pantry shelf with the confidence of something designed to remain there until the household ran out of better ideas. Opening it was part of the experience. In many kitchens, a small metal key was used to peel a narrow strip from the can, the lid curling away while someone tried not to cut a finger or drop the key behind the stove. Then the block of Spam had to be persuaded onto a plate, sometimes sliding free with a soft sound and sometimes requiring a knife around the edges. Cut into thick slices and laid in a hot skillet, it browned quickly, releasing a salty, savoury smell that reached the breakfast table before the eggs were ready. The edges became crisp, the centres stayed tender, and the slices could be served beside fried eggs tucked between bread or diced into potatoes. It was packaged meat in its most unmistakable form, practical enough for the pantry, and distinctive enough that nobody at the table had to ask what was cooking. Spam and eggs worked because both ingredients were flexible. Eggs could be fried in the same skillet after the meat was browned, picking up the flavour left behind in the pan. Toast filled the plate, coffee appeared for the adults, and breakfast became substantial without requiring fresh sausage or bacon. At supper, the same slices might be served with canned vegetables, macaroni, rice, or potatoes. A small amount could be diced and scattered through a larger dish, allowing the salty meat to season every bite without needing to dominate the plate. Families encountered Spam differently according to region, culture, military experience, household income, and personal taste. Some considered it a dependable pantry food. Others treated it as an occasional novelty or emergency meal. In Hawaii and in several Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, canned meat developed culinary meanings far richer than the jokes often made about it elsewhere. A responsible memory of the food has to leave room for all of those experiences. Children frequently judge Spam by texture before flavour. The smooth block looked suspicious while cold, but the skillet could improve its reputation by giving the outside a browned crust. Ketchup, mustard, or eggs softened the saltiness, and a sandwich made the shape less obvious. Adults who had known canned meat during military service or earlier periods of shortage sometimes brought those habits into the family kitchen. Although not every memory was affectionate, the practical appeal remained clear. The can could wait patiently in the cupboard, required no butcher paper, and could become breakfast, lunch, or dinner with very little warning. Yet someone still had to open it, slice it evenly, watch the skillet, and clean the layer of grease that cooled in the pan. The product was convenient in the manner of many 1960s foods. It shortened the journey to the table without removing the person responsible for making sure everyone reached it. A few shelves away or inside the refrigerator's meat drawer, bologna waited in a round stack separated by thin sheets of paper. For countless lunchboxes, it became the familiar centre of a sandwich made from soft white bread, mustard, mayonnaise, or sometimes nothing at all. The preparation was almost ceremonial in its simplicity. 2 slices of bread were placed on wax paper. A slice or 2 of bologna went between them. The sandwich was pressed flat-wrapped and fitted beside an apple, cookies, potato chips, or a thermos bottle. By lunchtime, the bread had absorbed a little moisture, the wax paper developed deep folds, and the sandwich carried the temperature and aroma of the closed lunchbox. When the lid opened in a classroom or cafeteria, the smell was immediate. Even before anyone saw the red ring around the edge of the meat, the sandwich had announced itself. Bologna suited the lunchbox because it was affordable, easy to portion, and familiar to children who might reject more complicated fillings. It required no carving and no concern about bones. A parent could make several sandwiches quickly on a school morning, while cereal bowls, permission slips, and missing shoes competed for attention. Household versions differed. Some included American cheese. Others added pickle relish lettuce or a generous stripe of yellow mustard. In certain families, the red casing was carefully removed before the sandwich was assembled. In others, children learned to peel it away at lunch or ate it without discussion. The bread could be white wheat rye or a regional favourite, but soft commercial slices became especially associated with the portable school sandwich. Its plainness was part of its strength. Bologna did not ask a tired parent to solve lunch. It merely asked to be placed between 2 pieces of bread. The same meat changed personality when it reached a skillet. Fried bologna curled upward as it heated the centre, rising while the edges browned against the pan. Some cooks cut a small slit into the edge to help it lie flat, although the slice often developed its own architecture anyway. Served beside eggs placed on toast or tucked into a warm sandwich, fried bologna became saltier, crisper, and more substantial than its cold lunchbox version. It could appear at breakfast after school, or during an inexpensive supper when the refrigerator held very little else. Children watched the slice form a shallow cup in the pan, and adults knew it had to be turned before the edges became too dark. Like Spam bologna was sometimes mocked because it was processed inexpensive and ordinary. But ordinary foods often carried the heaviest household responsibilities. They had to be available, acceptable, easy to divide, and capable of feeding people on schedules that did not pause for culinary ambition. Spam and bologna survived because they could move through the day. 1 can or package could support eggs in the morning, sandwiches at noon, and a skillet meal in the evening. They belonged to military memories, regional traditions, working family budgets, school lunch routines, and kitchens where shelf life mattered as much as flavour. Some people remember them warmly. Others remember the exact moment they decided never to eat them again. Both reactions reveal how closely food becomes attached to repetition. A bologna sandwich made once is simply lunch. The same sandwich wrapped every school morning becomes part of childhood. As the lunchbox closed and the skillet cooled, another small can waited near the sandwich bread, filled not with neat slices but with a finely ground, strongly seasoned spread. Deviled ham would take the convenience of canned meat and compress it into something that could cover an entire piece of bread with one careful sweep of a knife. A small can of deviled ham could disappear behind the bread box, the soup cans, or the jar of peanut butter, yet it was capable of becoming lunch almost immediately. Once opened, it revealed a finely ground pink spread with a salty seasoned aroma, unlike sliced ham from the refrigerator. A table knife lifted it from the can and pressed it across soft white bread crackers toast or small sandwich rolls. Some families mixed it with mayonnaise mustard, pickle relish chopped celery, or a little onion. Others used it exactly as it came, trusting the seasoning already inside. The word deviled did not mean the meat was fiercely hot. In American food language, it usually suggested that something had been chopped or mashed and given a lively amount of seasoning. To a child studying the contents of the can, however, the explanation mattered less than the texture, which looked smooth enough to be mysterious and familiar enough to be placed in the lunchbox anyway. Deviled ham belonged to the older pantry tradition of keeping concentrated foods that could wait until they were needed. It required no roasting, carving, or careful use of leftovers. A small amount could be spread thinly across several sandwiches, especially when lettuce, cheese, or another filling helped provide volume. On mornings when several lunches had to be assembled before school, that speed mattered. Wax paper was pulled from the box, slices of bread were arranged on the counter, and the spread was divided with the quiet judgment required to make each sandwich look roughly equal. One child might receive a thicker layer because he was older. Another might insist that the filling stop well before the crust. A parent could prepare the entire operation in a few minutes while listening for the toaster locating a thermos lid and reminding someone that a library book did not belong beneath a cereal bowl. The can was convenient. The morning remained complicated. The spread also appeared at picnics, road trips, fishing outings, and informal weekend lunches because the unopened can travelled easily and took up very little space. Once at the table, deviled ham could be spooned onto crackers and presented as a snack, although the arrangement became more respectable if someone added pickles, celery sticks, olives, or a small dish that was normally reserved for company. In some homes, it was mixed with softened cream cheese or mayonnaise and turned into a dip. In others, it remained a plain sandwich filling associated with school days and hurried meals. Its strongest flavour was useful because a thin layer still made its presence known. That was one reason shelf-stable meat spreads could serve a budget-conscious household well. They supplied the suggestion of a hearty meat sandwich without requiring a thick portion. The product promised efficiency in a very compact form. It was almost too efficient. A knife could spread the aroma across the entire kitchen long before it finished spreading the ham across the bread. Children's reactions depended heavily on how the sandwich was prepared and how often it appeared. Some liked the smooth filling because there were no large pieces of meat, fat, or onion to inspect. Others distrusted anything that could be applied with the same motion as peanut butter, but did not taste remotely like it. The sandwich changed during the hours inside a closed lunchbox. The bread softened, the filling warmed slightly, and the aroma waited beneath the wax paper until noon. When the wrapping opened, classmates could often identify the contents before seeing them. That smell might produce envy in one child and immediate relocation in another. A few crackers or potato chips added crunch, while a pickle provided acidity strong enough to compete with the spread. There was no universal deviled ham lunch. Some families treated it as ordinary pantry food, others as an occasional convenience, and many rarely bought it at all. Its place depended on region income, family habits, and the range of products carried by the local store. The little can also reflected a larger change in the American grocery basket. Meat no longer had to arrive only from a butcher counter wrapped in paper and intended for cooking that evening. It could be canned, ground-seasoned, branded, advertised, and stored until a schedule demanded it. That did not make it a replacement for fresh ham or homemade sandwich fillings. It gave the household another option, especially when refrigeration space was limited or the grocery trip had to last several days. The appeal was practical, but the work of making the food acceptable still belonged to the person preparing it. A little mustard might sharpen the flavour. Relish could soften the saltiness. Celery supplied texture. The crusts might be removed for a luncheon plate while a school sandwich was pressed together and wrapped without ceremony. Convenience products often succeeded not because families used them exactly as the package suggested, but because household cooks learned how to adjust them until they belonged to the family. Deviled ham did not entirely vanish. Similar canned spreads remained available, although their place in everyday lunch-making became smaller as supermarkets offered more refrigerated cold cuts, prepared salads, frozen snacks, and individually packaged foods. The old can now triggers a memory larger than its size: a knife scraping the bottom, a stack of crackers, wax paper folded around a sandwich, and the particular scent of a lunchbox opened after several hours. It reminds us that forgotten food is not always a lost recipe. Sometimes it is a product that still exists but no longer occupies the same dependable corner of the pantry or the same place in the weekly routine. The tiny can represented a form of convenience that could be stored at room temperature and turned into lunch by hand. Beyond it, the next generation of convenience waited behind a colder door. In the supermarket freezer case, breaded fish sticks and individual chicken pot pies promised that supper could arrive already. Shaped, portioned, and covered with frost, a cardboard box came out of the supermarket freezer with a faint layer of frost clinging to its corners, and inside it waited a row of breaded rectangles that looked nothing like the fish from which they'd been made. Fish sticks were tidy uniform and designed for a baking sheet, rather than a frying pan full of splattering oil. The cook arranged them in straight lines, slid the tray into the oven, and listened for the timer while tartar sauce, ketchup, lemon wedges, or canned vegetables appeared on the table. Their shape was part of their success. There were no visible bones, no skin, no head, and very little evidence that dinner had once been swimming. For children uncertain about fish, that distance could be useful. For parents trying to serve a quick meal on a school night, it was even more useful. The freezer had transformed fish into something that could be counted, portioned, and placed on a plate with almost no negotiation until the first child asked whether ketchup counted as a vegetable. Fish sticks were especially suited to evenings when the family schedule had become more complicated. School activities, work hours, church meetings, errands, and television programs all competed with dinner preparation. A box could remain frozen until needed, and the cook did not have to clean a whole fish, remove bones, or manage the smell of fresh seafood in a small kitchen. The breading promised a crisp exterior, although results depended on the oven, the baking sheet, and whether anyone remembered to turn the sticks. Placed too close together, they steamed rather than browned. Left in too long, the ends became hard while the centres lost their moisture. Prepared correctly, they emerged golden and hot, with a mild interior that accepted nearly any sauce placed beside it. The meal often included frozen peas, canned corn, French fries, coleslaw, or a slice of bread, creating a plate built almost entirely from foods that had arrived already measured and ready for heat. Some households connected fish sticks with Friday dinners, particularly where religious practice encouraged meatless meals on certain days. That association varied by family denomination, region, and level of observance, but it gave frozen seafood a dependable place in the weekly routine. Fish sticks also appeared on school cafeteria trays, where their uniform shape made them easy to cook and distribute in large numbers. A child who disliked the version at school might still accept the version at home because the home plate came with familiar ketchup and fewer witnesses. Another child might love both, especially when the breading was crisp and the inside remained mild enough not to challenge anyone. Adults remembered them differently too. For some, they were a practical introduction to seafood. For others, they represented the point at which fish became so convenient that it no longer seemed to belong to the sea at all. The breading did most of the public relations work, A few feet farther along the freezer aisle, small chicken pot pies rested inside boxes nearly the size of paperback books. Each pie came in its own shallow foil pan sealed beneath a pale frozen crust. At home, the cook placed the pan on a baking sheet and cut small openings in the top so steam could escape. Then came the long oven wait, during which the crust began to brown, and the kitchen filled with the smell of pastry and chicken gravy. The finished pie looked compact and self-contained, but its temperature was deceptive. The crust might seem ready while the filling beneath it remained capable of burning the roof of a mouth with almost scientific precision. Families learned to let the pie rest, although hungry children often treated that instruction as an unnecessary theory proposed by adults. Breaking through the crust revealed small pieces of chicken, peas, carrots, and potatoes suspended in thick gravy. The first spoonful released a cloud of steam and caused the pastry around the opening to collapse inward. Some diners carefully worked around the edges, mixing crust with filling one section at a time. Others removed the top crust, almost completely ate the filling, and saved the browned pastry for last. The foil pan made the portion feel personal, much like a television dinner, but the intact crust gave the meal a more homemade appearance. It suggested a traditional pie even when the factory had mixed the filling, shaped the dough, sealed the package, and frozen the entire dinner long before it reached the kitchen. The cook's role was shorter but still important. Someone had to protect the oven from bubbling gravy, judge whether the center was hot, and explain why the smallest pie in the house required one of the longest waits. Frozen chicken pot pies also solved the question of unequal preferences. One family member could eat a pie while another received leftovers, a sandwich, or something else from the freezer. They were useful for a parent working late, an older child, capable of following oven instructions, or a household evening when everyone arrived at a different time. Yet the individual portion could be both convenient and limiting. A hungry teenager might consider one pie an introduction rather than dinner. A younger child might eat only the crust and peas, leaving a foil pan full of carefully excavated carrots. Families watching expenses had to compare the cost of several individual pies with a larger homemade dish, but the frozen version offered storage, predictability, and freedom from preparing pastry. It was not always cheaper in every calculation. It was cheaper in attention, and attention was becoming one of the household's most valuable resources. Fish sticks and chicken pot pies represented a freezer aisle learning how to imitate the shapes of home cooking. One offered breaded portions that removed the complications of fresh fish. The other placed chicken, vegetables, gravy, and crust into a personal metal pan. Both made dinner easier to store and simpler to schedule, but neither guaranteed a peaceful table. Children still rejected vegetables ovens, still heated unevenly, and someone still had to remember the timer. The freezer did not replace family meals so much as give families more ways to assemble them. As the empty boxes were flattened and the foil pans cooled beside the sink, another form of convenience waited in the pantry rather than the freezer. It came in a cardboard box with dry noodles and a packet of brilliant orange powder, promising that cheese supper and childhood satisfaction could all be created in one saucepan. A cardboard box waited in the pantry beside canned soup rice and packages of noodles light enough for a child to lift and dependable enough for a parent to keep as a backup plan. Inside were dry macaroni and a separate packet of powdered cheese, seasoning an arrangement that looked almost too simple to become dinner. Water was brought to a boil, the pasta went into the saucepan, and the packet remained on the counter until the noodles were drained. Then milk and butter or margarine were added, followed by the powder, which disappeared into the hot macaroni and turned it a bright, unmistakable shade of orange. The sauce thickened as it was stirred, coating the spoon, the noodles, and eventually the sides of the pan. By the 1960s, boxed macaroni and cheese had become a familiar pantry shortcut in many American households, especially on evenings when time was short. the grocery budget was tight, or the person cooking needed a meal that children were unlikely to question for very long. Its attraction began with predictability. A casserole made from leftovers could change every time, and a stew might depend on whatever vegetables remained in the refrigerator, but the macaroni in the box was expected to taste nearly the same from one preparation to the next. Children knew the colour, the shape, and the soft texture before the bowl reached the table. Parents knew how many servings the package claimed to contain, although actual family experience sometimes disagreed with the arithmetic printed on the side. For a small child, one box could seem enormous. For several hungry siblings or a teenage boy returning from practice, it could vanish with surprising speed. The cook learned whether the household needed one box, two boxes, or a second side dish standing nearby. Canned peas, sliced hot dogs, leftover ham, tuna, or ground beef might be stirred in when the macaroni needed to become a more complete supper, rather than a bowl of comforting starch. Preparing it was easy but not effortless. The water still had to reach a full boil, and the macaroni needed attention because it could shift from firm to soft while someone answered the telephone or settled an argument in the next room. After draining the noodles, had to return to the pot quickly enough to remain hot. Butter sometimes refused to melt evenly, milk could be poured too generously, and the cheese powder had a talent for collecting in bright orange pockets, unless the spoon worked carefully through the entire pan. Too little liquid left the sauce dry and grainy. Too much produced noodles swimming in a thin yellow bath. The ideal texture existed somewhere between the two, and was often found by instinct rather than measurement. The meal saved time, but it still relied on someone who understood the stove, the saucepan, and the difference between stirring and merely moving the spoon around. The flavour was mild, salty and familiar, which made it useful in households where several tastes had to meet at one table. Black pepper might be added to the adult portions. Children sometimes covered theirs with ketchup, a decision that could produce quiet concern from anyone who had spent time achieving the correct sauce consistency. Some families baked the prepared macaroni in a casserole dish with breadcrumbs or extra cheese on top, combining the speed of the box with the appearance of a more traditional oven dish. Others served it straight from the saucepan in cereal bowls, or beside meatloaf, fried bologna, fish sticks, or sandwiches. It could be a main course, a side dish, an after-school meal, or the solution offered when a child refused whatever everyone else was eating. Its flexibility was not glamorous, but glamour had little value at 5:30 on a weekday when homework was unfinished, and the kitchen clock seemed to be moving faster than usual. Boxed macaroni and cheese also represented a growing trust in food, manufactured to be stored, measured, and completed at home. The factory supplied the pasta and seasoning in stable form. The household supplied water, milk, fat, heat, judgment, and whatever additions made the dish feel personal. This was not the complete surrender of cooking to a package. It was a partnership between industrial convenience and domestic adjustment. One parent added sliced frankfurters because the children liked them. Another stirred in tuna because a meatless supper was needed. Someone else used less butter, more milk, or an extra slice of processed cheese because that was how the family expected it to taste. The instructions offered a standard version, but the kitchen rarely left a standard version untouched for long. Even one of the simplest boxed foods became part of the family's private recipe system. For children, the food carried memories beyond the flavour. There was the sound of dry noodles rattling inside the box, the steam rising, when the colander was lifted from the sink, and the moment the orange powder fell into the pot. Older children could sometimes prepare it with limited supervision, making the box a small step toward independence. They learned to watch boiling water avoid touching the hot pan and clean the saucepan before the sauce hardened around the edges. That final lesson was often the least popular. Once cooled, the cheese mixture clung to the pot with determination, creating a yellow ring that resisted casual rinsing. The meal might have been quick, but the pan remembered it for the rest of the evening. Convenience as usual had solved the problem of what to serve more thoroughly than the problem of what to wash. The boxed dinner remained popular because it answered several household needs at once. It was inexpensive compared with many meat-centered meals, compact enough for the pantry, easy to recognize and adaptable to whatever else was available. It did not disappear after the 1960s. Instead, it survived, changed packaging, gained competitors, and became so ordinary that its earlier role as a modern convenience could be forgotten. For families during the decade, however, the packet of cheese powder represented something new and reassuring, a dependable result waiting inside a lightweight box. The next meals would rely on many of the same ideas, but the noodles would meet ground beef and tomato sauce rather than orange seasoning. One would be known as American goulash, while the other would hide grains of rice inside meatballs until they pushed outward like tiny quills. Elbow macaroni rattled into a pot of boiling water, while ground beef browned in a deep skillet beside it, filling the kitchen with the smell of onion tomato and supper already taking shape. American goulash was not the paprika-rich stew associated with Hungary. In many American homes, it was a practical combination of ground beef, macaroni, tomatoes, onions, and whatever seasonings the cook considered necessary. Some families called it goulash. In parts of New England, a related version might be called American chop suey. Elsewhere, it was simply macaroni and hamburger because not every weekday dinner required an impressive name. The ingredients varied, but the purpose remained familiar. A pound of beef could be distributed through enough pasta and sauce to feed several people, and the entire meal could be prepared in one large pan if the cook timed the noodles carefully. The result was red, warm filling, and almost impossible to serve without leaving a small streak of tomato sauce somewhere on the stove. The dish accepted whatever the refrigerator and pantry were willing to contribute. Canned tomatoes, tomato sauce, or tomato paste could form the base. Green pepper, celery, garlic, corn, or canned mushrooms appeared in some versions, while others remained deliberately plain because the children had already declared onions controversial. A little water or broth loosened the sauce, and dried herbs gave it the suggestion of Italian cooking without requiring anyone to define exactly which country the meal represented. Grated cheese might be passed at the table, although many families served the goulash without it. The macaroni absorbed sauce as the dish rested, so a pan that looked slightly loose on the stove could become surprisingly thick by the time everyone sat down. Leftovers continued the process overnight. The next day's portion often held together firmly enough to be cut with the edge of a spoon, but a splash of water and a warm skillet could persuade it to become dinner again. American goulash was especially useful because it did not expose the household budget too clearly. The ground beef remained visible, but no one had to count individual pieces. Pasta supplied volume, tomatoes supplied colour, and the onions made the kitchen smell as though the meal had required more planning than it sometimes had. The cook could increase the amount of macaroni when extra relatives appeared, when a child brought home a friend, or when the package of beef looked smaller than expected after it reached the skillet. White bread, a simple salad, or canned vegetables completed the table. The dish could be spooned into bowls for children, served on plates for adults, and reheated for anyone arriving late. It did not depend on an exact shape or presentation. Its success was measured by whether the pan was large enough, the macaroni was tender, and the sauce reached every serving. Those were modest standards, but weekday dinners survived by meeting modest standards consistently. Ground beef and rice offered another method of stretching meat, although this one arrived at the table with a name designed to interest children. Porcupine meatballs were made by mixing uncooked rice into seasoned ground beef and shaping the mixture into balls. As they simmered or baked in tomato sauce, the rice absorbed liquid and expanded with pale grains pushing through the surface of the meat. The finished meatballs resembled tiny porcupines closely enough for the name to make sense, provided nobody examined an actual porcupine for comparison. The preparation could begin on wax paper, a mixing bowl, or directly over the kitchen counter, while the cook combined meat, rice, onion, salt, pepper, and sometimes egg or other binders. The meatballs were arranged in a covered skillet or casserole dish surrounded by tomato sauce soup or another seasoned liquid and left to cook until the rice was tender. The rice was more than a visual trick. It extended the meat-absorbed flavor and helped each portion feel larger without requiring additional beef. That made porcupine meatballs useful during periods when the grocery budget demanded careful planning. They could be served with mashed potatoes, green beans, carrots, or bread, although the rice inside them already supplied much of the starch. The cook faced one important complication. The grains needed enough liquid and enough time to soften completely. Meatballs removed too early could contain rice with an unpleasant crunch, while too much sauce or overcooking could cause them to lose their shape. A covered pan helped trap moisture, and the smell of tomato and onion gradually filled the kitchen as the meatballs simmered. Children sometimes watched for the rice to appear through the surface, treating dinner as a small scientific demonstration. Any meal that made economy look like a transformation had already solved part of the problem. Like American goulash, porcupine meatballs were flexible enough to become family property. One household used canned tomato soup, another preferred plain tomato sauce, and another added Worcestershire sauce, brown sugar, garlic, or herbs. Some meatballs were small and numerous. Others were large enough that one or two formed a full serving. The recipe could arrive from a newspaper column, a community cookbook, a manufacturer's booklet, or a card copied from a relative. After several years, the original sauce mattered less than the changes written in the margin. Use less onion, add more sauce, cover tightly, double for company. Those short instructions recorded the practical knowledge that printed recipes could not anticipate. They also showed how convenience, ingredients, and home judgment worked together. A can might begin the sauce, but the family decided what the meal eventually became. American goulash and porcupine meatballs stretched the same package of ground beef in two visibly different directions. One scattered the meat through macaroni and tomato sauce until every spoonful carried a little of everything. The other shaped it into individual portions, hiding rice inside until the grains appeared during cooking. Neither dish was genuinely Hungarian, exotic, or elaborate, despite names that suggested travel or wildlife. Their importance was domestic. They helped a cook feed a family, manage leftovers, adjust portions, and create a meal that children could remember by sight as well as taste. When the last macaroni was scraped from the skillet and the final meatball disappeared beneath tomato sauce, the next dinners would ask more patience from the stove. Swiss steak would slowly tenderize an economical cut of beef, while stuffed bell peppers would turn green shells into edible containers for meat rice. And another round of family negotiation. A broad piece of beef lay on a cutting board beneath a sheet of wax paper, while the dull side of a heavy knife, a meat mallet, or a handheld tenderizer pressed a pattern into its surface. Swiss steak did not earn its name from cheese alpine villages or a dependable connection to Switzerland. The word referred to the process of Swissing, a mechanical method used to soften a firm cut of meat before slow cooking. In a 1960s kitchen, round steak or another economical cut might be dusted with flour seasoned with salt and pepper and worked until the fibers began to surrender. The meat was then browned in a heavy skillet before tomatoes, onions, celery, green peppers, or gravy were added. A lid covered the pan, the heat was lowered, and time performed the work that the grocery budget could not. The kitchen gradually filled with the smell of beef, tomato, and onion, while a piece of meat that had begun the afternoon stubborn and lean moved slowly toward tenderness. Swiss steak belonged to a household style of cooking that understood the difference between an inexpensive cut and a bad meal. Tougher beef was not necessarily rejected. It was pounded, floured, browned, covered, and cooked long enough to become manageable. The method demanded patience more than expensive ingredients. Some cooks used canned tomatoes while others relied on tomato sauce, condensed soup broth, or pan gravy. Carrots or celery might join the skillet, and onions often softened until they nearly disappeared into the sauce. The exact recipe varied widely, but the practical logic remained consistent. Browning created flavor. Moisture prevented the meat from drying. Slow heat softened the fibers. Flour helped thicken the liquid into something that could be spooned over mashed potatoes, noodles, rice, or bread. By supper, the skillet held not only meat, but enough sauce to carry the rest of the plate. A small serving of beef looked more generous when surrounded by gravy vegetables and a mound of potatoes ready to absorb every drop. The difficulty was knowing when the steak had cooked long enough. A recipe could provide a time, but the meat did not always read the same instructions. One cut softened quickly. Another remained determined after an hour and required more liquid, more patience, and a later dinner. The cook lifted the lid, released a cloud of steam, and tested the meat with a fork while trying not to lose too much heat. If the sauce became too thick, water or broth was added. If it remained thin, the lid might be left slightly open. Meanwhile, the potatoes had to finish at approximately the same moment the vegetables needed warming, and the family wanted to know when supper would be ready. Swiss steak appeared calm once arranged on the plate, but its tenderness represented a long negotiation between meat moisture temperature and the person standing beside the stove. Convenience products could assist the sauce. They could not persuade the beef to hurry. For many families, the dish carried the smell of a slow afternoon meal rather than a rushed evening one. It could simmer while laundry was folded, floors were swept. Children returned from school and a radio played near the kitchen doorway. The covered skillet or roasting pan became part of the household schedule, requiring only occasional attention, but refusing to be forgotten entirely. Leftovers could be reheated the following day, often tasting richer after the meat rested in its sauce overnight. Swiss steak was not a fashionable restaurant steak brought into the home. It was a demonstration of domestic skill applied to an ordinary cut. The cook knew how to make it tender, how much sauce the family expected, and which person would avoid the onions even after they had cooked into near invisibility. The meal offered comfort, but the comfort came from technique. It tasted as though the meat had always intended to become soft. Only the cook knew how much persuasion had been required. Nearby, green bell peppers stood upright in a baking dish after their tops had been removed and their hollow centers cleaned of seeds. Stuffed peppers transformed a vegetable into an individual container for ground beef, rice, onions, tomato sauce, and whatever seasoning belonged to the household recipe. Some cooks boiled or steamed the empty peppers briefly before filling them, hoping to soften the thick green walls. Others stuffed them raw and trusted the oven to complete the job. The filling might include cooked rice, uncooked rice prepared with enough liquid leftover meat, breadcrumbs, cheese, or canned tomatoes. Once packed, the peppers were arranged closely so they would not tip over, covered with sauce, and baked until the filling was hot and the green shells had softened. From above, the dish looked orderly and generous, each person receiving a complete portion. From a child's point of view, it looked like perfectly good meat and rice had been hidden inside a vegetable large enough to require formal negotiations. Stuffed peppers made practical use of modest ingredients. Rice stretched the ground beef tomato sauce added moisture, and the pepper supplied both flavor and presentation. A small amount of meat could fill several shells, especially when onions, rice, or breadcrumbs increased the volume. The dish also accepted leftovers well. Cooked rice from an earlier meal could return inside the filling, while a little remaining tomato sauce found a useful purpose at the bottom of the baking dish. In summer or early autumn, families with garden peppers could build the meal around produce that arrived faster than it could be eaten. Other households purchased firm green peppers from the supermarket because they were affordable, sturdy, and available more reliably than many seasonal vegetables had been in earlier generations. The meal appeared complete without needing a separate starch, although bread, potatoes, or a simple salad might still reach the table. The pepper held everything together at least until the first fork cut through the side and the filling spread across the plate. The family conflict usually concerned whether the container itself had to be eaten. Adults who enjoyed the slightly bitter flavor cut the softened pepper into pieces and gathered a little green wall with every bite of meat and rice. Children often approached the problem differently. They excavated the filling from the center, leaving behind an empty shell that looked remarkably clean for something officially served as dinner. A parent might insist that the pepper was the point of the meal. A child might privately conclude that the pepper had merely been packaging. Other children loved the softened vegetable, particularly when tomato sauce and melted cheese covered its stronger flavor. These differences explain why stuffed peppers could be remembered as comfort food in one household and as a dinner table examination in another. The meal was economical, colourful, and carefully portioned, but it also required everyone to confront a large green vegetable with nowhere to hide. Swiss steak and stuffed peppers both asked time to improve inexpensive ingredients. One softened a firm piece of beef beneath tomatoes and a lid. The other baked ground meat and rice inside a vegetable until separate parts became one meal. Neither was truly difficult, but both rewarded experience. The cook had to judge moisture, tenderness, timing, and the patience of the people waiting at the table. These were meals that stretched the grocery budget without looking unfinished, placing sauce, vegetables, and carefully prepared meat at the center of the plate. When the skillet and baking dish were finally carried to the sink, the next foods would move from the center of dinner to its crowded edges. Green beans would disappear beneath condensed soup and fried onions, while sliced potatoes and leftover ham would settle into another casserole, proving that the side dish could demand nearly as much attention as the main course. A glass baking dish arrived at the table with its edges still bubbling, and the smell of mushrooms, green beans, and browned onions reached the room before the serving spoon touched the surface. Green bean casserole turned a familiar vegetable into something creamier, softer, and considerably more difficult to describe as plain. Canned or frozen green beans were folded into condensed mushroom soup, sometimes loosened with milk and seasoned with pepper or soy sauce, then covered with crisp fried onions. The casserole baked until the sauce thickened around the beans and the onion topping darkened at the tips. By the 1960s, this kind of recipe fit neatly into American kitchens already stocked with canned vegetables, condensed soup, and oven-proof serving dishes. It required no complicated sauce-making, used ingredients that could wait in the pantry, and looked generous enough for Sunday dinner, a holiday table, or a church basement where every dish needed to survive transportation beneath aluminum foil. The fried onions gave the casserole much of its personality. Without them, the dish was soft from top to bottom, a quiet mixture of beans and creamy sauce. With them, the surface crackled beneath the spoon, at least during the first few minutes after leaving the oven. Some cooks mixed part of the onions into the casserole and saved the rest for the top. Others guarded the entire can until the last stage, hoping the topping would remain crisp. Children who normally pushed green beans around the plate sometimes accepted them more willingly when they arrived beneath soup and onions, although others carefully removed the fried pieces and left the beans behind. The casserole's success depended less on disguising the vegetable than on surrounding it with familiar flavors and a texture associated with special meals. It made an inexpensive side dish appear prepared complete and worthy of the better serving spoon. The beans were still present. They had simply hired a much stronger public relations department. Its practical value became even clearer during holidays and potlucks. Fresh vegetables could demand washing, trimming, careful timing, and last-minute attention. Green bean casserole could be assembled ahead, covered, refrigerated, and placed in the oven, while the cook handled meat rolls, desserts, and several relatives asking whether anything needed to be done. The ingredients were easy to double for a larger dish, and the finished casserole could travel in the same glass container in which it had baked. At a church supper, family reunion, or neighborhood meal, it occupied the dependable territory between plain vegetables and richer casseroles. It was familiar enough that people knew what they were taking, yet distinctive enough to be recognized across the table. Not every family served it, and recipes varied, but the combination became strongly associated with gatherings where several cooks brought dishes from several kitchens, and everyone silently hoped the onion topping had not softened during the drive. A second baking dish approached the same household problem with potatoes and leftover ham. Scalloped potatoes began with thin slices arranged in overlapping layers, usually with milk or a simple white sauce, butter, flour, onion, salt, and pepper. Some households added cheese, although that moved the dish closer to what many cooks called potatoes au gratin. When pieces of ham were tucked between the layers, the side dish became substantial enough to serve as supper. The potatoes absorbed the milk and meat juices as they baked while the top browned, and the edges developed a thick, creamy border against the dish. The aroma moved slowly through the house because scalloped potatoes could not be hurried without consequence. Thick slices remained firm. Too much liquid left the center loose. Too little caused the upper layers to dry before the bottom softened. The recipe was simple on paper, but the oven decided how simple it would feel in practice. Ham often entered the casserole after appearing in a more formal meal. A baked ham served on Sunday or during a holiday could return the next day in sandwiches, eggs, beans, or scalloped potatoes. Small pieces that looked insufficient as individual servings became plentiful once distributed through several layers. The salt from the meat seasoned the sauce, and the potatoes supplied the volume necessary to feed the family again without presenting the same plate twice. This was household economy practiced quietly. Leftovers were not merely reheated, they were reorganized. A few slices of ham, a pan of potatoes, and enough milk could become a new dinner, whose origin was visible only to the person who had planned both meals. For families trying to make one grocery purchase last through the week, that skill mattered as much as any recipe printed in a magazine. The casserole turned yesterday's center of attention into today's supporting ingredient. Preparing scalloped potatoes required physical work that the finished dish rarely revealed. Potatoes had to be peeled or scrubbed, sliced evenly, and layered without leaving large gaps. A knife created slightly irregular rounds, while a mechanical slicer could produce thinner pieces at the cost of requiring great respect for one's fingertips. A sauce might be cooked separately in a saucepan or flour, and seasonings might be scattered between layers before milk was poured over everything. The baking dish then occupied valuable oven space for a long stretch of the afternoon. Someone tested the center with a knife, covered the top if it browned too quickly, and waited while the potatoes ignored the official serving time. When finally ready, the dish retained heat with impressive loyalty. The first spoonful could burn a mouth even after the surface had stopped bubbling, a fact usually discovered by the hungriest person at the table. Green bean casserole and scalloped potatoes with ham showed how side dishes could carry the same responsibilities as the entree. One relied on canned and packaged ingredients to create speed, consistency, and a recognizable potluck favorite. The other used thyme layering and leftovers to turn potatoes into the foundation of another meal. Both filled large baking dishes, stretched modest ingredients, and required someone to coordinate oven space with everything else being served. They also reflected two forms of 1960s convenience living side by side. One opened cans and combined products developed for modern kitchens. The other used an older strategy, making yesterday's meat useful again through careful preparation. As the serving spoons rested in creamy sauce and the last crisp onions disappeared from the top, the refrigerator offered an entirely different kind of side dish. Inside waited bright gelatin, canned fruit, coconut and marshmallows, foods that could appear beside the main course while quietly behaving like dessert. A ring-shaped mould waited on the refrigerator shelf, trembling slightly whenever the door opened, and reflecting the ceiling light through layers of red, orange or green gelatin. Inside were pieces of canned pineapple, mandarin, oranges, pears, cherries, or fruit cocktail suspended at different depths, as though the refrigerator had preserved a tiny underwater garden. Jell-O fruit salad could arrive in a plain glass bowl, but the moulded version carried more ceremony. The cook dissolved flavoured gelatin powder in hot water, added cold water or fruit juice, waited for the mixture to thicken just enough, and then folded in the fruit without allowing every piece to sink to the bottom. Once poured into a metal, glass or plastic mould, the dish occupied valuable refrigerator space for several hours. Nothing could bump it. Nothing warm could be placed beside it. The refrigerator had become both appliance and stage manager, guarding a dish that would later be turned upside down before an audience of relatives. Removing the mould required confidence. The outside might be dipped briefly in warm water, a knife loosened around the edge, and a serving plate pressed firmly over the top. Then came the turn. For one suspended second, the cook had no proof that the gelatin intended to leave the container. A gentle shake followed, then a soft release as the entire shape dropped onto the plate. When it worked, the ring stood glossy and complete with fruit visible through its coloured walls. When it did not, the cook repeated the warm water treatment while trying not to melt the outer layer. A damaged mould could still be served in a bowl, but everyone understood that the dramatic entrance had been lost. This was one reason gelatin dishes carried a strange combination of convenience and suspense. The ingredients were inexpensive, the preparation looked simple, and the final result depended on chemistry timing, refrigerator temperature, and the willingness of a slippery dessert to cooperate. The word salad covered an unusually wide territory in mid-century American kitchens. A gelatin dish might appear beside ham casseroles, rolls, and vegetables, rather than waiting with the cakes and pies. Some versions contained only fruit. Others included cottage cheese, cream, cheese nuts, shredded vegetables, mayonnaise, or whipped ingredients depending on the recipe and the courage of the person preparing it. Families differed sharply in what they considered normal. One household remembered strawberry gelatin with bananas as a dependable holiday side. Another served lime gelatin with pears. Someone else knew a layered version so pale and creamy that the original flavour could no longer be identified by sight. These dishes were not eaten by everyone, and they were not all equally common, but they matched several needs of the period. They could be prepared ahead, carried to gatherings made from pantry ingredients, and presented in shapes that made an ordinary table look more festive. Children often judged gelatin by colour first and ingredients second. A bright red mould suggested dessert until a piece of celery or cottage cheese appeared inside it. Fruit cocktail was usually easier to accept because each spoonful might contain a cherry, grape, or cube of peach. Bananas presented a timing problem because they darkened, while fresh pineapple could interfere with setting unless it was treated or replaced with canned fruit. Many household cooks learned these rules through experience package directions, recipe booklets, women's magazines, or advice passed between relatives. The dish also changed while waiting. Fruit could sink, nuts could rise, and a creamy layer might separate into a pattern that looked intentional if nobody asked too many questions. Yet even imperfect gelatin could trigger strong memories. The cold metal mould, the wobble beneath the serving spoon, the canned fruit sweetness, and the small argument over whether the dish belonged beside the turkey or beside the pie. A few shelves away, ambrosia waited in a large glass bowl beneath plastic wrap or wax paper. Unlike the smooth transparency of gelatin, ambrosia looked soft, pale, and loosely assembled. Canned pineapple or citrus formed the fruit base, while shredded coconut provided sweetness and texture. Depending on the family and the recipe, the bowl might also contain marshmallows, whipped cream, whipped topping, sour cream cherries, grapes, or nuts. Earlier forms of ambrosia had been simpler, and household versions continued to vary by region and generation. By the 1960s, many families knew a creamy interpretation that appeared at holidays, church suppers, reunions, and tables, where several dishes were competing for refrigerator space. It was called a salad, served like a side dish, and tasted enough like dessert to make the category almost ceremonial. Ambrosia did not cross the line between salad and sweets. It simply behaved as though the line had never been officially approved. The dish was easy to assemble, but it benefited from time in the refrigerator. The coconut softened, the fruit chilled, and the marshmallows absorbed moisture until their surfaces lost some of their powdery firmness. Canned fruit had to be drained carefully, so the mixture would not become watery. Whipped ingredients needed gentle folding rather than aggressive stirring, and a bowl prepared too early could grow soft while one made too late lacked the blended texture people expected. For a gathering, ambrosia offered useful advantages. It required no oven, could be doubled without changing the method, and looked generous when spooned into a decorative bowl. A single cherry placed on top gave the impression that someone had planned the presentation, even if the rest of the dish had been assembled between several more demanding recipes. At a crowded potluck table, ambrosia was recognizable from a distance: white clouds, bright fruit, and the occasional pink or red piece announcing that restraint had not been the main objective. Ambrosia could carry very different memories from one family to another. In some southern households and holiday traditions, it was a familiar celebration dish with older roots and carefully defended ingredients. In other homes, it arrived from a magazine recipe or a neighbour's table and became popular because children liked marshmallows more than vegetables. Some people remember the coconut fondly. Others remember spending the entire meal avoiding it. One family used real whipped cream, another relied on a prepared topping, and another preferred a Tangier mixture held together with sour cream. These differences mattered because nostalgic food is rarely one fixed recipe. It is a pattern of substitutions shaped by region, income, product, availability, religious gatherings, family taste, and the person who happened to own the serving bowl. The name remained the same while the contents changed from kitchen to kitchen. Jell-O fruit salad and ambrosia represented a refrigerator-centered style of hospitality. Both could be prepared ahead, both depended on canned fruit and modern packaged ingredients, and both gave the cook a dish that looked festive without occupying the oven. They also revealed how flexible the word salad had become when families needed something sweet enough for children, decorative enough for company, and practical enough to survive several hours before serving. Neither dish vanished completely, but both became less central, as tastes moved away from moulded presentations and creamy fruit mixtures. The memories remained in the wobble of a gelatin ring, the coconut clinging to a spoon, and the refrigerator shelf cleared carefully for a bowl covered in wax paper. Next, that shelf would hold a quieter plate, a scoop of cottage cheese beside canned peaches, or pineapple arranged on lettuce, as a light luncheon that reflected another side of 1960s food culture. A pale scoop of cottage cheese sat in the centre of a lettuce leaf surrounded by canned peach halves, pear slices, or a ring of pineapple that still carried the faint sweetness of its syrup. The plate looked cool, orderly, and deliberately restrained, especially after the casseroles, gravies, and gelatin moulds that filled so many other 1960s tables. Cottage cheese with canned fruit appeared at kitchen lunches, department store counters, diners' hospital trays, and meals prepared for someone who wanted something described as light. The cottage cheese came cold from a waxed carton, its small white curds holding a little cream between them. The fruit arrived from a can opened with a metal turnkey or hand-cranked opener, then drained over the sink before being arranged beside the cheese. A cherry, a spoonful of mayonnaise, or a dusting of paprika might appear for decoration, while a lettuce leaf gave the plate the formal appearance of a salad, even when its main duty was to keep the cottage cheese from sliding toward the peaches. The combination belonged partly to the period's growing interest in controlled portions, and foods presented as sensible alternatives to heavier meals. Women's magazines, newspaper food pages, restaurant menus, and product advertising frequently offered carefully arranged luncheon plates built around cottage cheese fruit, hard-boiled eggs, tomato wedges, canned tuna, or sliced cold meat. The language surrounding these meals often promised freshness, neatness, and moderation, although the nutritional ideas behind them varied and changed over time. At home, the plate could be prepared without heating the oven or dirtying a skillet, which made it useful on warm afternoons or busy days. It also allowed the cook to serve herself quickly after feeding everyone else, though that convenience sometimes concealed a less comforting expectation. The person responsible for the family's meals was often encouraged to manage her own appetite with far more discipline than anyone required from the people eating meatloaf at supper. Canned fruit made the plate possible in any season. Peaches, pears, pineapple, and fruit cocktail could remain in the pantry until needed, offering consistent sweetness without peeling, slicing, or worrying about bruised produce. The can opened with a soft metallic crack syrup poured into the sink or a measuring cup, and the fruit was lifted carefully so the pieces would remain intact. A peach half could be placed hollow side up and filled with cottage cheese, creating a small edible bowl. A pineapple ring might sit beneath the scoop like a yellow platform. Pears were usually arranged in pairs because one slice looked accidental and three threatened the geometry of the plate. Children sometimes received the same ingredients in a less formal bowl, while adults were given the version with lettuce, a salad fork, and the quiet suggestion that presentation could turn two refrigerator items into lunch. Cottage cheese divided families as reliably as any food with a visible texture. Some people loved its mild, slightly tangy flavour, and the way the curds contrasted with sweet fruit. Others stared at the small white lumps and concluded that no amount of pineapple could improve the situation. The liquid at the bottom of the carton made the texture even more suspicious to reluctant children, while adults debated whether large curd, small curd, creamed, or drier cottage cheese was the proper choice. Black pepper could move the plate towards savoury territory. Cinnamon or a spoonful of fruit syrup moved it back toward dessert. Some households added sliced tomatoes, cucumbers, or crackers, while others served the cheese inside canned peach halves at Sunday lunch. The combination was simple enough to seem universal, yet it varied according to region, income, store selection, family custom, and whether the cook considered cottage cheese a salad ingredient, a diet food, a protein, or merely something that needed to be used before the carton expired. The luncheon plate also carried a particular social appearance. Unlike a sandwich eaten over the sink or leftovers reheated in a saucepan, it looked arranged. Each ingredient remained in its own space, the colours were visible, and the serving could be made to appear generous without becoming heavy. At a lunch counter, the plate suggested a customer who intended to eat politely and return to the afternoon without requiring a nap. At home, it could be placed beside iced tea coffee or a glass of milk and eaten at the kitchen table while the radio played. The meal required almost no cooking, but someone still washed the lettuce, opened the can, drained the fruit, spooned the cheese, and returned the remaining portions to the refrigerator. Even this quiet plate depended on household management. The convenience came from preparation done elsewhere, milk cultured and packed, at a dairy fruit peeled and canned in a factory lettuce transported to the supermarket, and a refrigerator keeping everything cold until noon. For some people, cottage cheese and canned fruit became associated with diets, doctors' instructions, or adults trying to reduce portions. For others, it was simply a familiar lunch served by a mother, grandmother, aunt, or diner waitress who considered the plate complete. The memory might be pleasant cold peaches on a hot day, the sweet syrup mixing with the creamy cheese, and a crisp lettuce edge left untouched at the end. It might also recall the feeling of being given the sensible meal while someone nearby ordered a hamburger. Nostalgia does not require pretending that every luncheon plate inspired joy. Its importance lies in how clearly it reflects the decade's household priorities: convenience without obvious indulgence, pantry fruit available throughout the year, dairy products promoted as practical meal components, and careful presentation used to make restraint look attractive. The cottage cheese plate gradually became less visible as restaurant menus changed, fresh fruit became more consistently available, and ideas about dieting and convenience shifted toward different products. Yet the combination never vanished entirely. It remained in family kitchens, institutional meals, salad bars, and the habits of people who still believed that a peach half and a scoop of cottage cheese required nothing more. The plate was cool, quiet, and modest, but the next desserts would make no such claim. Pineapple rings would be arranged in a brown sugar glaze before a cake was turned dramatically onto a platter, while vanilla wafers and bananas would soften beneath layers of pudding. The refrigerator and pantry were about to stop practicing restraint. A heavy cake pan waited on the counter with a glossy layer of melted butter and brown sugar spread across the bottom. Pineapple rings were arranged over it in careful circles, each yellow slice placed as though the entire success of the dessert depended on symmetry. Maraschino cherries often filled the open centers, adding bright red spots that would later appear on top when the cake was turned out. Batter was poured gently over the fruit, covering the design and making it disappear beneath a pale surface. Then the pan went into the oven where the sugar darkened, the pineapple warmed, and the kitchen filled with the smell of butterfruit and cake. Pineapple upside-down cake was not invented in the 1960s, but it remained a familiar company dessert during the decade because it used dependable pantry ingredients and produced its own decoration. There was no frosting to spread, no layers to align, and no pastry bag to locate in the back of a drawer. The pan performed the decorating provided the cook was willing to trust the final turn. That turn was the moment everyone remembered. After baking, the cake rested just long enough to settle, without allowing the caramelized sugar to harden against the pan. A serving plate was placed upside down over the top. One hand held the plate, the other supported the warm pan, and the entire arrangement was flipped in a single motion. For a second, nothing could be seen except the bottom of the baking pan. The cook lifted it slowly, hoping every pineapple ring had released and every cherry remained where it belonged. When the cake dropped cleanly, the surface shone with brown sugar glaze, and the fruit appeared as neatly arranged as it had before the batter covered it. When one ring stayed behind, it could be lifted with a spatula and returned to its place with the quiet confidence of someone correcting a minor architectural problem. The guest did not need to know. A little extra glaze could hide almost anything. Canned pineapple made the dessert practical throughout the year. The rings were uniform, already peeled and sturdy enough to survive baking. The juice could be measured into the batter used in another recipe, or saved in a glass jar in the refrigerator until someone remembered why it was there. Boxed cake mix appeared in some kitchens while other cooks prepared the batter from flour, sugar, eggs, shortening and baking powder. Both methods could produce a dessert that looked more elaborate than the labour suggested. That appearance mattered when relatives came for Sunday dinner. Neighbours stopped by, or a church gathering required something attractive enough to compete with several other cakes. Pineapple upside-down cake arrived already glazed, already decorated, and already portioned visually by the rings on its surface. A cook could place it on the table with confidence, even if the centre had sunk slightly or one cherry had migrated during the turn. Children were drawn to the bright fruit and sticky edges, although opinions divided over the actual pineapple. Some wanted the slice with the largest cherry. Others preferred a corner where the brown sugar had become dark and chewy against the pan. A child who disliked baked fruit might carefully remove the pineapple and eat only the cake beneath it, leaving a perfect ring on the plate as evidence. Adults often appreciated the way the fruit kept the top moist, and the caramelized sugar gave an ordinary cake a richer flavour. The dessert also carried an element of performance. Unlike a frosted layer cake that arrived fully assembled, the upside-down cake revealed itself in the kitchen. Anyone nearby could watch the pan lift and discover whether the pattern had survived. That brief suspense gave the dessert a family ritual beyond its taste. The cake was not merely served. It was unveiled. Banana pudding offered a quieter kind of transformation. Instead of being turned onto a platter, it was built in layers inside a glass bowl or rectangular dish. Vanilla wafers formed the first layer, followed by sliced bananas and warm homemade custard or prepared pudding. The pattern continued until the dish was full with more wafers arranged across the top or around the edge. Some versions finished with whipped cream. Others used a browned meringue, especially when the pudding had been made with separated eggs, and the cook wanted the dessert to enter the oven one final time. At first, the wafers remained crisp and distinct. After several hours, they absorbed moisture from the pudding and bananas, becoming soft enough to cut with a spoon. That softening was not a flaw, it was the point. The refrigerator completed the dessert by turning separate layers into one creamy, tender mixture. The dish was especially familiar in Southern homes, church suppers, reunions, and family gatherings, although recipes and traditions varied widely. Homemade custard required attention. Milk had to be warmed without scorching eggs tempered, so they would not scramble, and the mixture stirred until it thickened enough to coat a spoon. Packaged pudding offered a faster route and a more predictable result, especially when several dishes were already competing for the cook's attention. Bananas created their own timing problem. Sliced too early, they could darken. Used when too ripe, they softened into the pudding almost immediately. Used when too firm, they lacked the sweet fragrance people expected. The cook also had to judge how many wafers were needed for the bowl, and how many would disappear before assembly, because children had discovered the open package on the counter. Banana pudding looked generous because a few bananas, a box of wafers, and a quantity of pudding could fill a large serving dish. It travelled well when covered could be made ahead, and became easier to serve as the layers softened. At a church basement table, the glass bowl revealed stripes of yellow fruit, pale custard, and rounded cookies pressed against the sides. At home, the dessert might wait behind the milk until dinner was finished, its top protected by wax paper or plastic wrap. The first serving came out neatly if the pudding had chilled long enough. Later spoonfuls became less orderly with wafers, bananas, and custard, blending together into a soft pile that tasted better than it looked. children searched for sections containing the most cookies. Adults sometimes preferred the edge where the wafers had absorbed the pudding while still holding a little shape. The final serving usually consisted of broken pieces and custard scraped from the bottom, claimed by whoever considered appearance less important than quantity. Pineapple upside-down cake and banana pudding both turned commercial pantry products into desserts that felt personal. Canned pineapple packaged wafers, cake mix or pudding powder shortened the process, but the cook still arranged, layered, watched, cooled and judged the moment when the dessert was ready. One depended on a dramatic flip and a pattern of fruit preserved in caramel. The other depended on patience while cookies softened and flavors settled together in the refrigerator. Both were suitable for company without requiring expensive ingredients, and both could become strongly associated with the relative who always made them. The next desserts would wait even more quietly behind the refrigerator door. An icebox cake would ask cookies and whipped cream to change overnight, while rice pudding would turn leftover grains milk and a little sweetness into a bowl remembered as either perfect comfort or an unnecessary place to put raisins. A narrow package of chocolate wafers waited beside a bowl of whipped cream, and neither ingredient looked capable of becoming a cake. There was no flour to measure, no oven to heat, and no layer pan to grease. The wafers were simply spread with cream and stacked upright in a row, or arranged in flat layers inside a glass dish until the package had been transformed into a long dark and white structure. More cream covered the outside, hiding the individual cookies beneath soft ridges made by a spoon. Then the entire dessert went into the refrigerator. An icebox cake depended on waiting. During the night, moisture from the cream moved into the crisp wafers, softening them until the stack could be sliced like a tender cake. The refrigerator performed the baking without heat, and the cook received credit for a dessert that had spent most of its preparation time quietly behind the milk. The method was older than the 1960s, but it remained well suited to households that valued desserts made ahead of time. On a warm day, the oven could remain off. When company was expected, the cake could be assembled before lunch and ignored until evening. The ingredients were easy to recognize, and the finished slices revealed dramatic stripes where the softened wafers crossed the cream. If the wafers had been stacked upright, the cake was often cut on a diagonal, so each serving displayed several dark lines. That angle mattered. Cut straight across the pattern could disappear, leaving a piece that looked as though the cook had misunderstood the assignment. The dessert required little technical skill, but it rewarded careful arrangement, enough refrigeration, and the ability to keep curious children from opening the door every 20 minutes to see whether the cookies had become cake yet. Household versions moved far beyond one wafer and cream combination. Graham crackers could replace chocolate wafers. Vanilla pudding, chocolate pudding, whipped topping sliced bananas, crushed pineapple or canned fruit might be layered into a rectangular dish. Some families made a refrigerator cake from cookies and sweetened cream, while others used a packaged mix or a recipe printed on the side of a box. The name icebox cake covered a broad family of desserts held together by one idea: dry layers became soft through contact with a creamy filling. That flexibility made the dessert useful when the pantry offered only a few ingredients. It also meant the final result varied sharply. One version sliced neatly and stood tall. Another collapsed into a delicious mound as soon as the serving spoon entered. The distinction mattered less once it reached the plate. By then the cookies had lost their crispness, the cream had absorbed their flavor, and the refrigerator had completed a transformation the oven never witnessed. The dessert carried the quiet drama of preparation done in advance. A freshly baked cake announced itself with heat and aroma. An icebox cake remained hidden, gathering no attention, while dinner was cooked and dishes were cleared. Its success could not be judged immediately. The cook had to trust that time would soften the layers without turning them watery, that the cream would remain firm enough to hold the shape, and that no uncovered onion or leftover casserole would donate an unexpected fragrance to the dessert. Refrigerator space became part of the recipe. The cake needed a level shelf protection from jars pushed backward, and enough room that the door could close without touching the serving plate. Convenience did not remove household planning. It merely moved the problem from the oven to the refrigerator. Rice pudding began with an even plainer ingredient, cooked rice left from an earlier meal or prepared specifically for the dessert. Mixed with milk, sugar, and sometimes eggs, the rice was simmered on the stove or baked slowly until the liquid thickened around the grains. Vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg, or a little butter added warmth, while raisins appeared in some households and were firmly excluded from others. The finished pudding could be served warm with steam rising from the bowl, or chilled until a thin skin formed across the surface. That skin became another family division. Some people considered it the best part. Others removed it carefully and placed it at the edge of the dish where it waited as a clear statement of disapproval. Rice pudding looked modest, almost colourless, but its smell of milk, vanilla, and spice could fill the kitchen with a comfort very different from the bright spectacle of pineapple rings or gelatin moulds. Its economy was difficult to miss. A small amount of rice expanded in milk and leftover grains that might otherwise have been ignored returned as dessert. For households shaped by thrift cultural tradition, or the simple rule that food should not be wasted, rice pudding made practical sense. The recipe could be adjusted according to what was available. Evaporated milk, whole milk, or another dairy mixture might be used. Eggs created a richer custard texture, while eggless versions remained softer and more direct. Some families added raisins early, so they would swell as the pudding cooked. Others scattered cinnamon across the top or spooned fruit beside it. The dish appeared in many ethnic and regional traditions, and no single American version represented them all. What united the memories was the slow thickening, the wooden spoon moving across the bottom of the saucepan, and the need to keep milk from scorching while someone elsewhere in the house asked whether the dessert was ready. Rice pudding demanded more attention than its simple ingredients suggested. On the stovetop, milk could catch at the bottom of the pan if stirring stopped for too long. In the oven, the pudding needed enough time to set without becoming dry. Rice continued to absorb liquid after cooking, so a mixture that looked properly loose, while warm could become much firmer in the refrigerator. The cook learned whether the family preferred it creamy, dense, warm, chilled plain, or heavily dusted with cinnamon. Leftovers might be eaten at breakfast, especially by anyone willing to argue that rice and milk made the bowl sensible before noon. Children who liked it often remembered the sweetness and softness. Those who disliked it usually remembered the raisins, the skin, or the unsettling possibility that yesterday's dinner rice had returned wearing dessert clothes. Icebox cake and rice pudding represented two opposite kinds of refrigerator memory. One relied on packaged cookies, whipped cream, and a striped presentation suitable for company. The other turned basic grains and milk into a quiet bowl shaped by thrift and family tradition. Both asked time to change texture. Wafers softened into cake while rice thickened into pudding. Neither needed elaborate decoration, and neither vanished completely, but both became less central as supermarket bakeries. Frozen desserts, instant mixes, and ready-made sweets offered faster choices. Their memories remain in a covered glass dish behind the milk, a spoon scraping cinnamon from the bottom of a bowl, and the patient instruction to leave dessert alone until it was ready. The next foods would begin the morning rather than end the evening. A frozen cylinder of orange concentrate would drop into a pitcher, while a jar of bright powder promised that the space age could be stirred into breakfast with a spoon. A small frozen cylinder sat on the counter, its cardboard sides beginning to soften, while the metal ends remained cold enough to sting the fingers. frozen orange juice concentrate had to be opened at both ends, or pushed from its container with the spoon dropping into a glass pitcher as one solid orange mass. Water was added by using the empty can as a measuring cup, usually several times, and then the mixture was stirred until no frozen lumps remained. The spoon struck the side of the pitcher with a bright clink, while the concentrate broke apart and spread through the water. What emerged was not quite fresh squeezed juice, and not quite a powdered drink. It was something new for many households, real orange juice reduced frozen, shipped through supermarket freezer cases, and restored in the kitchen before breakfast. The little can fit neatly into the growing freezer habits of the 1960s. Families who once depended more heavily on canned juice seasonal fruit or oranges squeezed by hand could keep several containers of concentrate beside frozen vegetables and ice trays. The product took up little room before mixing and produced a full pitcher once water was added. That efficiency mattered in refrigerators, with small freezer compartments already crowded by ice cream fish sticks, pot pies, and packages wrapped in white freezer paper. A parent could prepare juice while toast browned, and cereal bowls were placed on the table, although the concentrate occasionally refused to dissolve, as quickly as the morning schedule required. A bright orange lump might continue circling the pitcher, while children waited with the impatience of people who had contributed nothing to breakfast preparation. The flavour depended partly on the person holding the empty can under the faucet. Too much water produced a pale drink that tasted as though the oranges had only passed through the kitchen. Too little created something sharp and heavy with sweetness and acidity, concentrated into every glass. Even when the measurements were correct, the mixture needed stirring again after it stood because pulp and heavier particles could settle toward the bottom. The first glass might appear smooth and light, while the last contained enough pulp to seem like a different product. Some family members liked that final serving. Others watched the pitcher carefully to avoid it. The can itself became a memory trigger, the frozen cardboard, the metal rim, the orange cylinder sliding free, and the practical habit of measuring water with the package that had just held the concentrate. Frozen orange juice also reflected how modern food technology was changing the meaning of freshness. The juice had been processed and frozen, yet its cold colour and citrus smell allowed it to feel closer to fresh fruit than many shelf-stable alternatives. Advertising and supermarket displays could present the freezer as a place where flavour waited in suspended animation, ready to return when water and a spoon were added. Household experience was less poetic but no less important. The product offered convenient storage and predictable supply, particularly when fresh oranges were expensive, inconvenient, or simply absent from the weekly shopping list. It did not eliminate work entirely. Someone still had to open the can without bending the lid, measure accurately, stir thoroughly, wash the sticky pitcher, and remember to return any remaining juice to the refrigerator before it warmed beside the breakfast dishes. Near the pitcher, another orange drink might come from a jar rather than the freezer. Tang appeared as a dry powder that could be scooped into cold water and stirred until the pale liquid turned an intense orange. The jar looked modern, the preparation took only moments, and the flavour was designed to be recognisable, even though nobody would mistake it for juice squeezed directly from an orange. Children could help measure the powder, sometimes adding an extra spoonful when adults were not watching. The granules gathered briefly on the surface before sinking and dissolving, leaving a faint ring around the inside of the glass pitcher. It was sweet tart and consistent. There were no seeds, no pulp, and no frozen cylinder to chase with the spoon. The drink represented convenience reduced to its simplest domestic form, powder water, and confidence. Tang became especially memorable because of its connection with the American space program. It was not invented for astronauts, but its use during human spaceflight gave the product a powerful association with rockets, capsule science, and the technological optimism of the decade. A jar on the breakfast table could seem connected, however indirectly, to the extraordinary machines shown on television. Children who followed space missions could drink something promoted as suitable for astronauts, even while sitting in pajamas beside a bowl of cereal. The contrast was almost perfect for the 1960s home. The kitchen remained filled with ordinary tasks, sticky spoons, unfinished homework, and someone searching for a missing shoe, while the package suggested that the future had already arrived and could be mixed by the teaspoon. Families did not respond to Tang in one uniform way. Some children loved its strong sweetness and bright colour. Others preferred frozen concentrate or ordinary juice, and thought the powder tasted unmistakably manufactured. Parents appreciated that the jar could remain in the pantry, that no refrigeration was required before mixing, and that a pitcher could be prepared quickly for breakfast snacks, picnics, or a group of thirsty children. The powder could also be made stronger or weaker according to household preference, although stronger was often the direction children preferred when left in charge. Like many convenience products, Tang succeeded partly because it was easy to store and difficult to misunderstand. The result was always orange, always sweet, and always ready faster than anyone could squeeze enough fruit for a family. Frozen orange juice concentrate, and Tang offered two different versions of the same promise. One used freezing to preserve and transport juice in a compact form. The other used dehydration and flavouring to create a drink that required no freezer at all. Both depended on the modern supermarket factory processing branded packaging and a household willing to complete the final steps. They also showed how breakfast was becoming a meeting place between older routines and new technology. Toast still burned, cereal still softened in milk, and children still arrived late to the table, but the drinks beside them came from processes that would have seemed remarkable a generation earlier. From the freezer can and the space-age jar, the story now moves toward another dry package waiting near the stove. Potato flakes would fall into hot liquid and rise almost instantly into a side dish that promised fewer peels, less boiling, and one more small victory over the clock. A cardboard box stood near the flour canister, and the packets of gravy mix holding potato flakes so light that they barely seemed capable of becoming food. Water and milk were heated in a saucepan, butter or margarine melted across the surface, and then the dry flakes were poured in while a spoon moved quickly through the steam. Within moments the liquid disappeared, and a pale mound rose from the pan. Instant mashed potatoes promised to remove the peeling, cutting, boiling, draining, and hand mashing required by fresh potatoes. For a 1960s household trying to place meat, vegetables, bread, and a hot side dish on the table at roughly the same time that promise was powerful. The box did not eliminate cooking, but it compressed a long sequence of work into a few measured steps. Dinner could now have mashed potatoes even when nobody had remembered to buy potatoes. Traditional mashed potatoes demanded more attention than their simple appearance suggested. A cook first searched the bag for potatoes without soft spots or sprouts, peeled them over the sink, cut them into pieces of similar size, and watched the pot closely enough to prevent a boil-over. Once tender, the potatoes had to be drained and mashed while still hot. Milk needed warming, butter had to be added, and the entire mixture required enough beating to become smooth without turning unpleasantly sticky. Lumps could remain if the masher missed a corner, while too much liquid created a loose mixture that spread across the plate. Instant flakes removed most of those uncertainties. The manufacturer had already cooked, dried, and reduced the potatoes into a form that could be restored with hot liquid. The household cook still controlled the final texture, but the hardest work had taken place before the box reached the supermarket shelf. Preparation was quick enough to happen after the main dish had nearly finished cooking. A parent could stir the flakes while gravy warmed and canned peas waited in another saucepan. That speed was especially useful on evenings when work-school activities, errands, or unexpected delays had pushed supper later than planned. Yet instant potatoes had their own narrow margin for error. Too many flakes created a stiff mound that held the shape of the spoon with alarming loyalty. Too much water produced a pale mixture that travelled across the plate in search of lower ground. The instructions offered measurements, but many cooks adjusted by sight, shaking in more flakes, or adding another splash of milk until the potatoes looked familiar. Butter, salt, pepper, and gravy helped bridge the difference between the package and the family's expectation. A box could provide the structure. The cook still supplied the rescue operation. Texture became the central argument. Some people appreciated the smooth consistency because there were no lump skins or uneven pieces. Others believed the absence of lumps was precisely what made the potato suspicious. Freshly mashed potatoes carried small variations that suggested a real vegetable had recently occupied the pot. Instant potatoes could appear almost too uniform, their surface smooth enough to resemble a carefully prepared display. Children often accepted them readily once gravy covered the top, especially beside meatloaf, Salisbury, steak-fried chicken, or Swiss steak. Adults were more likely to compare them with the potatoes made by a mother or grandmother who never measured the milk. One household served the flakes only during emergencies. Another used them every week. A third combined instant potatoes with fresh ones, gaining speed, while preserving enough texture to avoid a dinner table investigation. The box also created new possibilities beyond the ordinary side dish. Leftover prepared potatoes could thicken soup, top a small casserole, or form the surface of a meat and vegetable pie. Dry flakes could sometimes be used as a coating or thickener, though household practices varied and package suggestions changed over time. Most families, however, valued them for the simplest reason: they waited in the pantry. Fresh potatoes could sprout, soften, or disappear into another meal. Potato flakes remained available for the evening when the refrigerator held meat and vegetables, but nothing suitable for filling the empty space on the plate. They were compact, predictable, and easy to divide. A small amount could serve one person arriving home late, while a larger saucepan could support a full family meal. The cook did not need to begin an hour in advance. Hot liquid and a spoon were enough to bring the side dish back into existence. Instant mashed potatoes also revealed how convenience was being redefined. Earlier pantry foods saved time because they were canned, preserved, or partly prepared. Potato flakes went further by changing the physical form of a familiar ingredient and asking the household to restore it. The product fit a decade fascinated by dehydration, freezing powdered drinks, concentrated juices and foods designed to travel efficiently through factories, trucks, supermarkets, and kitchen cabinets. The modern home was becoming the final assembly point in a much larger food system. A family might eat meatloaf shaped by hand vegetables from a can, gravy from a packet, and potatoes rebuilt from flakes all on the same plate. The meal still felt homemade because someone stood at the stove combined. The parts adjusted, the seasoning called everyone to the table, and knew exactly which child would ask whether the potatoes were real. For the person responsible for dinner, few appeals could mean more than a clever product slogan. It meant less time standing at the sink, fewer heavy pots, less planning, and one side dish that could wait until the last few minutes. That saved attention might be spent helping with homework, preparing another part of the meal, caring for a younger child, or simply reaching the table before everything else became cold. The convenience was real, even when the flavor did not satisfy everyone. It should not be dismissed as laziness or praised as a complete domestic revolution. It was a tool, and families judged it according to their needs. Some kept the box for emergencies. Some preferred it to fresh potatoes. Others tried it once and returned permanently to the peeler. The flakes promised less work, but they could not decide what counted as acceptable mashed potatoes in a particular home. Instant mashed potatoes complete the 30 foods on this list, but they do not complete the story behind them. Each television dinner casserole canned spread frozen pie gelatin. Mould, powdered drink and pantry box depended on forces larger than one kitchen. Supermarkets grew freezer cases, expanded, branded packages became more persuasive, and manufacturers promised that modern food could save time without taking away the familiar shape of family dinner. The next part moves beyond individual dishes to the aisles, advertisements, appliances, and household schedules that place them on the table. The foods may look unrelated when scattered across 30 memories, but together they reveal how the American kitchen was being reorganized one box can tray and carefully measured cup of water at a time. A shopping cart rattled across polished tile beneath rows of fluorescent lights, passing pyramids of canned goods, stacked cereal boxes and freezer cases glowing behind glass. By the 1960s, the supermarket had become more than a larger version of the neighborhood grocery store. It was a carefully arranged system of choices, signs, packages, demonstrations, coupons, and promises. A family could move from fresh meat to canned soup, from frozen fish sticks to powdered drinks, and from produce to cake mix without leaving the building. Paper bags weighted near the checkout trading stamps might be handed over with the receipt, and a child riding beneath the cart handle could watch an entire week of meals being assembled aisle by aisle. The 30 foods in this story did not all begin in the supermarket, but the expanding store gave many of them a brighter stage. It placed older dishes beside new packages and taught shoppers to imagine dinner not only as something cooked from ingredients, but also as something selected from competing solutions. The freezer case made that change especially visible. Its cold glass displayed television dinners, pot pies, fish sticks, vegetables, orange juice concentrate, and desserts in colourful boxes that allowed shoppers to see the finished meal before opening the package. The photograph on the front was important because the frozen contents themselves offered very little charm. A block of concentrate, a pale pot pie, or a row of breaded fish rectangles needed help explaining what it would become. Packaging supplied the future version: browned crust, crisp breading, bright vegetables, and a table where nobody seemed concerned about oven timing. As home refrigerators gained more useful freezer space, families could keep meals available for evenings that did not follow the plan. The freezer became a second pantry, though a more temperamental one. Packages had to fit between ice trays, frozen meat, and half-finished cartons of ice cream, while frost slowly reduced the available space until someone finally faced the unpleasant task of defrosting it. Elsewhere in the store, cans and boxes offered another kind of security. Condensed soup could become sauce, casserole binder, or gravy. Canned tuna could wait until noodles and peas turned it into supper. Canned fruit supplied pineapple rings for cake peaches for a luncheon plate, and colourful pieces for gelatin salad regardless of season. Boxed macaroni and cheese, instant potatoes, pudding mixes, and powdered drinks reduced ingredients into measured components designed to be completed in the kitchen. These products did not always replace home cooking. More often they entered it. A cook combined a factory-made base with milk meat eggs, vegetables, leftovers, seasoning, and family judgment. The finished dish might follow the package recipe closely the first time, then change over the years until it belonged entirely to the household. Add less water, use 2 cans, leave out the peppers, double the topping. Printed instructions opened the door, but handwritten notes decided whether the product would be invited back. Advertising helped packages speak before shoppers touched them. Magazine pages, newspaper inserts, radio announcements, Television commercials, store displays and labels promised convenience, consistency, nutrition economy, modernity, or some combination of all five. A frozen dinner suggested freedom from washing several pans. A powdered drink borrowed excitement from science and space travel. A casserole recipe showed how one can of soup could make an ordinary vegetable suitable for company. The advertisements usually presented a calm kitchen, cheerful children, and a cook who seemed to have completed every task without spilling anything on the counter. Real kitchens were less cooperative. Children rejected ingredients ovens heated unevenly, and the quick recipe still required opening, draining, mixing, baking, serving, and cleaning. Yet the advertising worked because the problem it addressed was genuine. Families wanted dependable meals, and the person responsible for producing them often needed more options than time allowed. Price influenced those choices as strongly as novelty. A shopper might arrive with a handwritten list newspaper coupons and a firm limit on how much the cart could contain. Ground beef could become meatloaf, sloppy joes goulash, Salisbury steak or porcupine meatballs depending on what else was affordable. A ham could appear first as a centerpiece and later inside scalloped potatoes. Rice noodles, potatoes, bread sauces, and canned vegetables helped distribute smaller amounts of meat across more plates. Convenience products could save labor, but they were not automatically the cheapest option, especially when several individual packages were needed for a large family. Shoppers compared price, portion, storage, preparation time, and the likelihood that children would actually eat the result. A box that cost slightly more might still enter the cart because it prevented waste or rescued an evening when everyone arrived home at a different hour. Household economy was not simply buying the least expensive item. It was deciding which expense created the fewest problems. The supermarket also widened the distance between the person eating the food and the place where it had been produced. Fish became breaded sticks. Potatoes became flakes. Oranges became concentrate or powder. Chicken and vegetables disappeared beneath a machine-sealed crust. These transformations offered real benefits: longer storage, predictable portions, easier transportation, and less preparation at home. They also changed the skills expected in the kitchen. A cook still needed judgment, but some tasks moved to factories while new tasks took their place. Reading package directions, managing freezer space, combining branded products, watching expiration dates, and coordinating several cooking times became part of ordinary meal preparation. The kitchen was no longer simply where raw ingredients became food. It was where fresh, frozen, canned, dried, and packaged components were assembled into a family meal that still needed to look familiar when it reached the table. None of this happened identically in every American home. Store size, income, region, race, religion, transportation, refrigeration, household size, and local food traditions shaped what families could buy and what they considered proper dinner. Some shoppers visited large suburban supermarkets once a week and filled the car with paper bags. Others relied on smaller neighborhood markets, rural stores, local butchers, gardens, community networks, or several shopping trips. Homemade foods, ethnic traditions, regional recipes, and fresh ingredients continued beside television dinners and powdered mixes. The 1960s menu was not a complete victory of convenience over tradition. It was a crowded negotiation between them. A gelatin mold could sit beside a family recipe older than the refrigerator. Instant potatoes could accompany meatloaf mixed by hand. Frozen orange juice could be poured at a breakfast table where the same coffee pot had worked for years. By the end of the decade, the supermarket had taught families to expect choice, and advertising had taught products to compete for a place inside the home. Some of the 30 foods endured because they remained inexpensive, adaptable, or emotionally familiar. Others lost their central place when schedules, taste appliances, health concerns, and shopping habits changed again. What survived most clearly was not always the flavour. It was the movement through the store, the boxes stacked above the freezer glass, the coupon folded inside a purse, the paper bags placed on the Formica counter, and the person deciding how those purchases would become breakfast, lunch, dinner, and leftovers. The final part returns from the supermarket to the quietest object in the kitchen, a recipe card stained at one corner carrying the small corrections and family memories that no package could print. A small recipe box sat in a kitchen drawer or on a shelf near the flour canister, filled with index cards written in blue or black ink. Some cards were clean and carefully copied. Others carried fingerprints, softened corners, and faint rings left by a measuring cup set down too quickly. One card might say tuna casserole in a mother's handwriting, followed by ingredients that no longer required exact amounts, because the cook already knew what the family preferred. Another might hold the instructions for pineapple upside-down cake with a note beside the baking time warning that the old oven ran hot. The stained corner mattered as much as the recipe. It showed that the card had been taken out repeatedly, placed beside a mixing bowl, touched with damp fingers, and returned to the box after feeding the same family many times. Packages could print instructions for millions of kitchens, but the handwritten card recorded what happened in one particular home. The 30 foods in this story rarely remained exactly as manufacturers' magazines or cookbooks presented them. A casserole recipe might begin on the back of a soup label, then lose the mushrooms because one child objected to them. A boxed macaroni dinner gained sliced hot dogs because the meal needed to serve more people. Instant potatoes received extra butter. Frozen orange juice was mixed with slightly less water, and banana pudding acquired another layer of wafers because somebody always searched for the cookies first. These changes were not usually announced as culinary creativity. They were simply corrections made through repetition. The cook discovered what the household would eat, what the budget could support, and what the oven would tolerate. Eventually, the revised version became the family version, even if its first ingredients had arrived from a factory test kitchen hundreds of miles away. A recipe card also preserved the labour that finished foods often concealed. Meatloaf reached the table as neat slices, but someone had handled the raw meat, measured the crumbs chopped. The onion shaped the loaf and judged whether the centre was done. Scalloped potatoes looked calm beneath their browned surface, though someone had peeled and sliced every layer. A gelatin ring shimmered under the dining room light only because the refrigerator had been rearranged to protect it for hours. Even the quickest foods asked for attention. Fish sticks needed turning, pot pies needed cooling, potato flakes needed adjustment, and a television dinner still had to be carried from the oven without bending the foil tray. Convenience reduced certain tasks, sometimes significantly, but it did not remove the responsibility of deciding what everyone would eat and making sure the meal appeared at the right time. That responsibility did not fall equally across every household, but in many families it rested mainly with women whose work was treated as routine precisely because it was performed so often. They remembered grocery prices, school schedules, dislikes, allergies, leftovers, payday, and how much milk remained in the refrigerator. They knew which meal could stretch when an extra child stayed for supper, and which dessert could travel safely to a church basement. A recipe written as 5 short lines might represent years of such knowledge. Add more sauce could mean the family had grown. Double for Christmas could recall a crowded table. Use the large dish might warn that the smaller one had overflowed into the oven once and never been trusted again. The card did not explain these stories. It assumed the person reading it already knew. The foods themselves carried mixed memories because family life was mixed as well. A television dinner could feel like an exciting private meal in front of a favourite programme, or it could mark an evening when everyone was too tired to sit together. Bologna sandwiches could mean school day comfort repetition or embarrassment when another child opened a more elaborate lunch. Franks and beans might recall summer camping for one person and the final meal before payday for another. Cottage cheese with canned fruit could feel refreshing, restrictive, or simply ordinary. Some children loved the bright wobble of gelatin and the powdered sweetness of tang. Others spent years trying to avoid them. Memory does not require agreement. The same dish can represent affection, thrift exhaustion celebration, and a texture one still finds difficult to defend. Many of these foods never completely disappeared. Meatloaf, banana pudding, boxed macaroni, green bean casserole, fish sticks, Spam instant potatoes, and several others remain available or continue to be cooked. What faded was often their position inside everyday family life. Some became holiday foods rather than weekly meals. Some survived mainly in particular regions or communities. Others lost attention as fresh ingredients became easier to obtain restaurant meals and takeout expanded. Microwave cooking accelerated household sizes changed, and family schedules became less centered on one shared dinner hour. A food can become forgotten without vanishing from the store. It may simply stop appearing often enough to define childhood, fill the refrigerator, or leave a permanent mark on the family recipe box. Yet ordinary meals deserve remembrance because they reveal how families adapted. They show the creativity of making 1 pound of beef serve several people, the patience of turning a firm cut into Swiss steak, and the practical wisdom of transforming leftover ham into another full dinner. They reveal enthusiasm for new technology, trust in modern packaging, and occasional disappointment when the photograph on the box proved unusually optimistic. They also remind us that inexpensive or processed food was not emotionally empty. Love could be served from a can of freezer tray or a packet of orange powder when that was what time and money allowed. The meal was simple. The effort behind keeping everyone fed was not. So when you remember one of these foods, preserve the detail that made it belong to your family. Was the meatloaf sweet on top? Did the pot pie always burn your mouth? Were raisins allowed in the rice pudding? Did someone hide the last vanilla wafers before the banana pudding was assembled? Share that memory, because the recipe alone cannot hold the sound of the can opener, the scrape of a fork against foil, or the voice that called everyone to the table. Somewhere, an old card may still be resting in a drawer with one stained corner, and an instruction that makes sense only to the people who ate from that kitchen. The handwriting may fade, the package may change, and the dish may appear less often. But a family meal has a stubborn way of surviving after almost everything else has been cleared away.